Home, though a concept many living things understand instinctively, becomes more complex when we consider it on a planetary scale. Every creature, from the smallest soil bacterium to the largest whale, exists within what we call habitat, the specific combination of conditions, resources, and relationships that make life possible. In recent centuries, these homes have been disappearing at an unprecedented rate. Tonight, we explore how the loss of habitat ripples through the web of life, touching every corner of our living world in ways both obvious and unexpected. What makes a place suitable for life? This question, simple as it sounds, opens into one of the most intricate puzzles in the natural world. Habitat, in its fullest sense, encompasses far more than mere geography or climate. It is the complete suite of conditions that allows an organism not just to survive, but to thrive, reproduce, and maintain its place in the ongoing story of life on Earth. Consider a single oak tree standing in what we might casually call a forest. To us, it appears as one element among many in a peaceful woodland scene, but for the countless organisms that depend on it, this oak represents an entire universe of opportunity and resources. Its bark provides hunting grounds for woodpeckers seeking insects. Its leaves offer food for caterpillars, which in turn become meals for migrating warblers. Its acorns sustain squirrels through harsh winters, while its fallen leaves decompose to enrich the soil that feeds its roots. The oak's massive trunk, with its deep furrows and hidden crevices, shelters everything from tiny spiders to roosting bats. Its branches support epiphytes, plants that grow harmlessly on other plants, creating aerial gardens dozens of feet above the forest floor. Even in death, the oak continues to serve, becoming a nurse log that nourishes seedlings and provides habitat for countless decomposers, from bacteria to beetles, that break down complex organic matter and return nutrients to the soil. This intricate web of relationships illustrates a fundamental principle. Habitat is not simply a place, but a living system of interactions between organisms and their environment. Every species requires a specific combination of physical conditions, chemical resources, and biological relationships to complete its life cycle successfully. Temperature ranges must fall within tolerable limits. Water must be available in appropriate quantities and quality. Food sources must be present and accessible. Safe sites for reproduction and shelter from predators must exist. But habitat extends beyond these basic necessities. Many species require particular substrates for nesting, the right kind of sand for sea turtles, specific tree species for certain birds, or particular soil conditions for wildflowers. Others depend on seasonal changes, like the precise timing of snowmelt for alpine plants, or the predictable flood cycles that many river species have evolved to exploit. The spatial arrangement of habitat components matters enormously as well. A meadow surrounded by forest provides very different opportunities than the same meadow isolated in agricultural land. The edges where different habitat types meet often support unique communities of species adapted to these transitional zones, called ecotones. These boundaries can be as important as the core habitats they separate. Consider how habitat functions for a species like the wood duck, one of North America's most distinctive waterfowl. These birds require a remarkably specific combination of habitat elements to complete their annual cycle. They nest in tree cavities near water, preferring old-growth trees with natural hollows, or abandoned woodpecker holes positioned over or very close to wetlands. The ducklings, upon hatching, must make a dramatic leap from the nest cavity to the water below, guided only by their mother's calls. The wetlands themselves must provide the right mix of shallow and deeper water, with abundant aquatic vegetation for food and dense emergent plants for cover. As seasons change, wood ducks need different wetland types: flooded timber in spring for courtship and early nesting, shallow marshes in summer for molting, and deeper water with abundant food in fall for building energy reserves before migration. Throughout their range, wood ducks also require corridors of suitable habitat that connect these seasonal needs. Isolated wetlands, no matter how pristine, cannot support sustainable populations if they lack connections to other habitat patches. This connectivity allows for the movement of individuals between populations, maintaining genetic diversity and providing refuges during local disturbances. The story becomes more complex when we consider that habitat quality can vary dramatically even within what appears to be suitable environment. A wetland may look perfect for wood ducks, but lack the specific invertebrates that ducklings need for protein during their rapid early growth. A forest may have plenty of large trees, but few with the right kind of cavities for nesting. Understanding habitat means understanding these subtle but critical details that determine whether a place can truly support a species over the long term. Climate forms the overarching framework within which all habitat relationships exist. Temperature and precipitation patterns determine which types of vegetation can grow in a given area, which in turn influences the entire community of organisms that can exist there. But climate operates on multiple timescales. Daily temperature fluctuations affect when insects are active, influencing feeding opportunities for insectivorous birds. Seasonal patterns determine breeding cycles, migration timing, and food availability. Long-term climate patterns shape the fundamental character of ecosystems over decades and centuries. The physical structure of the landscape also plays a crucial role in habitat quality. Topography influences drainage patterns, creating the wet hollows where certain plants thrive and the well-drained slopes where others dominate. Geological factors determine soil chemistry, affecting not just plant communities, but also the invertebrates that depend on specific mineral concentrations. Even seemingly minor features like fallen logs, rock outcrops, or small depressions can create microhabitats that support specialized species. Disturbance, rather than being purely destructive, often forms an integral part of habitat dynamics. Many ecosystems have evolved with periodic fires, floods, windstorms, or other disruptions that reset succession, create openings for light-demanding species, and maintain the mosaic of habitat types that support diverse communities. The timing, intensity, and frequency of these disturbances can be as important as their occurrence. Water availability and quality represent another fundamental dimension of habitat. In terrestrial systems, this might mean the presence of springs, streams, or seasonal pools. In aquatic systems, it encompasses factors like dissolved oxygen levels, pH, nutrient concentrations, and temperature regimes. Many species require very specific water chemistry conditions, and even small changes can make habitat unsuitable. The biological components of habitat are equally crucial. Predator-prey relationships, competition for resources, mutualistic partnerships, and the complex food webs that connect species all influence habitat suitability. A flowering plant might require specific pollinators to reproduce successfully. A predator needs adequate prey populations to sustain itself. A seed-dispersing animal depends on fruit-producing plants for food, while helping those plants colonize new areas. Human activities have begun to alter virtually every aspect of this intricate habitat architecture. We drain wetlands, fragmenting the connected landscapes that species like wood ducks require. We suppress natural fire cycles, allowing forests to become unnaturally dense and eliminating the openings that many species need. We alter stream flows with dams and diversions, disrupting the seasonal patterns that aquatic species have evolved to follow. Urban development replaces complex natural habitats with simplified environments dominated by non-native species. Agricultural conversion transforms diverse plant communities into monocultures that support only a fraction of the original species diversity. Even seemingly minor changes, like introducing artificial lighting or altering soil chemistry through fertilizer runoff, can have profound effects on habitat quality. Understanding habitat in its full complexity helps us appreciate why habitat loss represents such a fundamental threat to biodiversity. It is not simply about the disappearance of places where animals and plants live. It is about the unraveling of countless intricate relationships that have developed over evolutionary timescales. When we destroy habitat, we break apart these carefully balanced systems, often in ways that are difficult to predict or reverse. This understanding also points toward the challenges and opportunities in conservation. Protecting habitat means more than simply setting aside land. It requires maintaining the processes, relationships, and connections that make ecosystems function. It means understanding that every species' habitat needs are unique and that effective conservation must account for this complexity. As we delve deeper into how habitat loss affects the living world, we carry with us this foundation of understanding. Habitat is not backdrop to life, it is the stage, the script, and often the actors themselves in the grand drama of existence on Earth. Its loss reverberates through every level of biological organization, from the physiology of individual organisms to the dynamics of entire ecosystems, setting the stage for the profound changes we see unfolding across our planet today. The transformation of Earth's landscapes has unfolded across millennia, but never at the pace we witness today. To understand how habitat loss affects life, we must first trace the story of how natural habitats have disappeared, been fragmented, and been fundamentally altered by human activity. This is not simply a tale of destruction, but rather a complex narrative of changing relationships between human societies and the natural world. For most of human history, our species existed within natural habitats rather than replacing them. Early hunter-gatherer societies, while certainly influencing their environments through practices like controlled burning and selective hunting, generally lived as integral parts of existing ecosystems. Their populations were small, their technology limited, and their impact, while real, was often indistinguishable from the natural disturbances that ecosystems had evolved to accommodate. The development of agriculture marked the first major shift in this relationship. Beginning roughly 10,000 years ago, in various parts of the world, humans began converting natural habitats to farmland on an unprecedented scale. Forests were cleared, wetlands drained, and grasslands plowed to create the simplified ecosystems we call crops. This agricultural revolution allowed human populations to grow dramatically, but it also represented the first systematic replacement of complex natural habitats with human-designed landscapes. Even these early agricultural transformations varied greatly in their impact on natural habitats. Traditional farming systems often maintained considerable habitat diversity. Small fields interspersed with hedgerows, woodlots, and wetlands created a mosaic landscape that, while certainly altered from its natural state, still provided habitat for many native species. Crop rotation, fallow periods, and the integration of livestock created dynamic systems that mimicked some aspects of natural disturbance patterns. The pace of habitat conversion accelerated dramatically with the rise of more intensive agricultural practices and expanding human populations. In Europe, the medieval period saw extensive forest clearing as growing populations needed more farmland and fuel. The famous Caledonian Forest of Scotland, once covering much of the Highlands, was gradually reduced to scattered remnants. Similar patterns played out across the globe as human societies developed the tools and social organization needed to transform landscapes on a continental scale. The arrival of European colonists in the Americas initiated one of the most rapid and extensive habitat transformations in recorded history. Within a few centuries, vast areas of forest, grassland, and wetland were converted to agriculture and settlements. The eastern deciduous forests that once stretched unbroken from the Atlantic coast to the Great Plains were reduced to scattered fragments. The tallgrass prairies of the Midwest, one of Earth's most extensive grassland ecosystems, were almost entirely converted to farmland. This transformation was not merely about clearing land for crops. It involved fundamental changes to ecosystem processes that had operated for millennia. Fire suppression eliminated the natural burning cycles that maintained prairie and savanna ecosystems. Stream channelization and wetland drainage altered hydrological patterns across entire watersheds. The introduction of non-native species, from crops and livestock to accidental introductions, began reshaping ecological communities in ways that continue to unfold today. The Industrial Revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries marked another acceleration in habitat loss. New technologies allowed for more efficient clearing of forests, draining of wetlands, and conversion of natural areas. Steam-powered machinery could accomplish in days what had previously taken months of manual labor. Railroad construction opened previously inaccessible areas to development and resource extraction. Mining operations stripped away entire mountainsides and filled valleys with waste. Industrial development also introduced entirely new forms of habitat degradation. Air and water pollution began affecting habitats far from their sources. Acid rain altered soil chemistry in forests hundreds of miles from industrial centers. Chemical runoff from factories poisoned rivers and lakes, creating dead zones where few organisms could survive. The byproducts of industrial society began to accumulate in the environment, creating novel toxicological challenges that natural systems had never encountered. The 20th century brought perhaps the most dramatic acceleration in habitat loss in Earth's history. Human population growth, mechanized agriculture, urbanization, and industrial development combined to transform landscapes at an unprecedented pace. Between 1,900 and 2,000, the global human population quadrupled, and the impact per person increased even more dramatically as technology and consumption expanded. Modern industrial agriculture converted remaining natural areas to simplified monocultures at a staggering rate. The development of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides allowed farming to expand into previously unsuitable areas while intensifying production on existing farmland. Large-scale mechanization enabled the cultivation of vast fields where diverse natural communities once thrived. In many regions, Agricultural landscapes became biological deserts, supporting little life beyond the intended crops. Urban and suburban development consumed natural habitats at an accelerating pace throughout the 20th century. Cities expanded outward in sprawling patterns that fragmented remaining natural areas. Suburban development, in particular, created landscapes of lawns and ornamental plantings that provided little habitat value for native species. Road networks carved up continuous habitats into isolated patches, creating barriers to animal movement and altering ecosystem processes. The scale of habitat transformation in some regions defies easy comprehension. In the continental United States, it is estimated that less than 4% of the original tallgrass prairie remains. Most of the remaining fragments are tiny patches surrounded by agricultural land. Wetlands have fared similarly poorly, with over half of the wetlands present in the lower 48 states eliminated since European colonization. In some states, the losses exceed 90%. Similar patterns have played out globally, though the timing and specific drivers vary by region. Tropical deforestation accelerated dramatically in the latter half of the 20th century as global markets for timber, palm oil, soybeans, and cattle expanded. The Amazon rainforest, Earth's largest tropical forest, lost an area larger than France between 1,970 and 2,000. Southeast Asian forests fell to palm oil plantations and urban development. African forests were cleared for agriculture and fuel wood as human populations grew. The methods of habitat destruction have become increasingly efficient and comprehensive. Where early forest clearing left stumps and root systems that could regenerate, modern clearing often involves complete removal of topsoil and transformation of the land surface. Strip mining removes entire ecosystems down to the bedrock. Urban development seals soil surfaces under concrete and asphalt, making restoration extremely difficult. Perhaps most significantly, the 20th century saw the emergence of habitat loss as a global phenomenon. While earlier habitat destruction was largely regional, modern transportation and communication networks created global markets for agricultural products, timber, and other natural resources. This globalization meant that habitat destruction in one part of the world could be driven by demand thousands of miles away. The development of industrial aquaculture and fishing also extended habitat destruction into marine and freshwater environments. Bottom trawling destroys seafloor habitats across vast areas of ocean. Dam construction fragments river systems and alters flow patterns that countless species depend upon. Coastal development eliminates wetlands and nearshore habitats that serve as nurseries for marine life. Modern habitat loss differs qualitatively from historical patterns in several important ways. The pace has accelerated exponentially, giving species little time to adapt to changing conditions. The scale has expanded to encompass entire landscapes and even global systems. The intensity has increased, with many modern land uses creating conditions that are completely incompatible with native species survival. Perhaps most importantly, modern habitat loss is occurring in the context of other global environmental changes that compound its effects. Climate change is shifting the geographic ranges where species can survive, just as habitat destruction is eliminating the places where they currently live. Pollution is degrading the quality of remaining habitats. Invasive species are altering ecological relationships in ways that can make restored habitats unsuitable for native species. The cumulative effect of these changes is a planet where natural habitats are increasingly rare, fragmented, and degraded. What remains is often insufficient to support the complex ecological processes and diverse communities that characterized pre human landscapes. Many regions now consist primarily of human dominated landscapes, with small, isolated patches of semi natural habitat scattered throughout. Understanding this history helps explain why habitat loss has become the primary driver of species extinction and ecosystem degradation worldwide. It is not simply that habitats are disappearing, but that they are disappearing faster than natural processes can adapt and at a scale that disrupts fundamental ecological relationships. The great unraveling of natural habitat networks has created a conservation crisis that touches every corner of the living world, from the smallest soil organisms to the largest mammals, setting the stage for the specific mechanisms through which habitat fragmentation affects ecological communities. Of all the ways that habitat loss affects life, fragmentation may be the most insidious. Unlike the obvious destruction of clear cutting or urban development, fragmentation works quietly, breaking apart continuous habitats into smaller and smaller pieces. The effects unfold gradually, sometimes over decades, as ecological processes slowly unravel in ways that are easy to overlook until the damage becomes irreversible. Imagine a vast forest as a single, living entity. Rivers of nutrients flow through its soil networks. Information travels along underground fungal highways connecting tree roots across miles. Air currents carry pollen, spores, and seeds from one end to the other. Animals move freely, following seasonal food sources, seeking mates, and dispersing to new territories. The forest breathes as one organism, its parts intimately connected by countless invisible threads. Now imagine a road cutting through this forest. At first glance, the impact seems minimal, just a narrow ribbon of asphalt through an ocean of green. The vast majority of the forest remains intact, but this simple linear intrusion has fundamentally altered the forest's functioning. What was once one continuous habitat has become two separate pieces, and the consequences of this division ripple outward in ways both subtle and profound. The road itself creates a barrier that many forest species cannot or will not cross. Small mammals like shrews and salamanders, adapted to the cool, moist conditions of the forest floor, find the hot, dry surface of the road as inhospitable as a desert. Many birds, despite their obvious ability to fly over such obstacles, exhibit surprising reluctance to cross even narrow openings in forest cover. Their evolutionary programming tells them that open areas mean danger, and this ancient wisdom keeps them within the familiar protection of the canopy. For those animals that do attempt to cross, the road becomes a death trap. Vehicle strikes kill millions of animals annually, from tiny insects to large mammals, but the mortality extends beyond direct collisions. The stress of navigating unfamiliar, dangerous terrain can weaken animals, making them more vulnerable to predators and disease. The energy expenditure required for longer, more circuitous movements around obstacles reduces the resources available for reproduction and survival. The barrier effect of roads and other linear features creates genetic isolation between populations that were once connected. Small populations on either side of the barrier begin to lose genetic diversity through random drift and inbreeding. Over time, these populations become increasingly distinct, losing the evolutionary resilience that comes from genetic mixing. Local populations become more vulnerable to disease outbreaks, environmental changes, and chance events that could drive them to extinction. The edges created by fragmentation introduce another set of challenges known collectively as edge effects. Where forest meets clearing, the microclimate changes dramatically. Temperature fluctuates more widely near edges, with hotter days and cooler nights. Humidity drops as wind penetration increases. Light levels rise, favoring different plant species than those adapted to the forest interior. These edge effects can penetrate hundreds of meters into remaining forest fragments, meaning that small patches may consist almost entirely of altered edge habitat, with little true forest interior remaining. Plant communities undergo significant changes in fragmented landscapes. Wind-dispersed seeds from agricultural fields and disturbed areas blow into forest edges, introducing weedy species that can outcompete native understory plants. Invasive plant species often thrive in edge environments, gradually spreading inward and altering forest composition. Many native forest plants, adapted to the stable conditions of large forest interiors, struggle to reproduce and maintain populations in the altered conditions of fragmented landscapes. The effects cascade through the food web in complex ways. Predators often require large territories to find sufficient prey and may disappear entirely from small fragments. This can lead to an increase in their prey species, which may then overconsume their own food sources. Pollinator networks become disrupted as the distances between flowering plants increase and suitable nesting habitat for native bees and other pollinators disappears. Seed dispersal networks fragment as the animals that transport seeds across the landscape lose the connected pathways they need to move effectively. Fragmentation affects species differently depending on their ecological characteristics. Area-sensitive species, those that require large unbroken habitats to maintain viable populations, are among the first to disappear from fragmented landscapes. These often include large predators, species with large home ranges, and those with specialized habitat requirements. Interior specialist species adapted to the stable conditions found only in large habitat patches also decline rapidly as fragment size decreases. Consider the wood thrush, a forest songbird whose haunting flute-like song once echoed through eastern North American forests. These birds require large blocks of mature forest for successful breeding. In small forest fragments, wood thrushes face increased rates of nest parasitism by brown-headed cowbirds, which prefer to lay their eggs in host nests near forest edges. They also experience higher predation rates as fragments contain proportionally more edge habitat where predators are more abundant. As forest fragmentation has accelerated across their range, wood thrush populations have declined by over 60% since the 1960 seconds. The problem compounds as fragments become increasingly isolated from one another. Even species that can survive in small habitat patches may struggle to recolonize areas where local populations have gone extinct. The matrix habitat between fragments, typically agricultural fields, suburban development, or other human-dominated landscapes, becomes increasingly difficult for native species to traverse. What ecologists call the rescue effect, where individuals from nearby populations can reestablish extinct local populations, breaks down as the distances between suitable habitats increase. Fragmentation also disrupts ecosystem processes that operate at landscape scales. Nutrient cycling becomes altered as the movement of materials between different habitat types is interrupted. Hydrological processes change as natural drainage patterns are modified by roads, ditches, and development. Fire cycles are disrupted, often leading to the buildup of fuels that can cause more severe burns when fires do occur. The natural disturbance regimes that many species depend upon become increasingly artificial or absent entirely. The temporal dimension of fragmentation adds another layer of complexity. The initial fragmentation event may cause immediate mortality and displacement, but many effects unfold over years or decades. Populations in newly isolated fragments may appear stable for some time before beginning to decline as genetic diversity is lost, demographic fluctuations become more severe, and environmental changes make fragments unsuitable. This extinction debt means that the full impact of fragmentation may not be apparent until long after the initial habitat loss occurred. Small fragments face particular challenges related to what ecologists call stochastic events, random fluctuations in environmental conditions, disease outbreaks, or demographic changes that can drive small populations to extinction. A drought that merely stresses populations in large habitats might eliminate entire populations in small fragments. A disease outbreak that reduces population size by half might be easily recovered from in a large population, but could drive a small population extinct. The shape and configuration of habitat fragments also matters enormously. Long, narrow fragments have more edge relative to their area than compact fragments, meaning they provide less interior habitat. Fragments that are close together may function more like a single large habitat if species can move between them, while widely separated fragments may function as completely isolated populations. The surrounding matrix habitat influences how permeable the landscape is to movement between fragments. Even seemingly minor features of fragmented landscapes can have major ecological consequences. A fence line may block the movement of small mammals. A gap in tree cover of just a few meters may prevent forest birds from moving between fragments. Power lines create corridors for edge species and predators to penetrate into forest interiors. The cumulative effect of numerous small barriers can be as significant as a single large one. Agricultural intensification in the matrix habitat between fragments can make landscapes increasingly hostile to native species. The widespread use of pesticides eliminates insect populations that many species depend upon for food. Herbicides eliminate the weedy plants along field margins that provide resources for many native species. The timing of agricultural activities, such as mowing during nesting season, can directly kill wildlife attempting to use agricultural areas. Urban and suburban fragmentation creates its own unique challenges. The matrix habitat consists of a complex mosaic of roads, buildings, lawns, and ornamental plantings that presents a maze of barriers and hazards for wildlife movement. Light pollution disrupts natural cycles and navigation patterns. Noise pollution interferes with animal communication. Domestic pets kill billions of native animals annually. The sheer density of human activity creates stress that can reduce reproductive success and survival rates, even in remaining habitat patches. Despite these challenges, some species have shown remarkable ability to adapt to fragmented landscapes. Edge species and habitat generalists may actually benefit from fragmentation as it creates more of the transitional habitats they prefer. Some species learn to use matrix habitats for movement or even as supplementary habitat. Others adapt behaviorally, such as birds learning to cross wider gaps or mammals becoming more nocturnal to avoid daytime traffic. Understanding fragmentation's effects has become crucial for conservation planning in human dominated landscapes. The insights gained from studying fragmented systems have led to new approaches in conservation biology, emphasizing the importance of connectivity, corridor creation, and landscape scale planning. This understanding points towards strategies for mitigating fragmentation's impacts, though the solutions are often as complex as the problems themselves. Fragmentation represents one of the most pervasive forms of habitat modification on Earth, affecting virtually every landscape where humans have established a presence. Its effects unfold at multiple scales, from the physiology of individual organisms to the dynamics of entire ecosystems, creating a complex web of ecological changes that cascade through natural communities in ways we are only beginning to understand. Among all Earth's terrestrial habitats, forests represent perhaps the most structurally complex and biologically diverse ecosystems. Their three-dimensional architecture creates a multitude of niches, from the dark, humid forest floor to the sun-drenched emergent canopy layer. When forests disappear, they take with them not just trees, but entire vertical worlds that have evolved over millions of years. The loss of forest habitat reveals itself as a cascading collapse of interconnected communities, each layer dependent on the others in ways both obvious and subtle. The forest canopy, that leafy ceiling stretching as far as the eye can see, functions as more than simply the uppermost layer of trees. It serves as the forest's interface with the sky, controlling the flow of light, moisture, and nutrients to everything below. When a mature forest is cleared, the immediate and most visible loss is this canopy layer, but the ecological consequences ripple downward through every stratum of the forest community. Consider an old-growth temperate forest with its massive trees reaching heights of 200 feet or more. These ancient giants have spent centuries growing toward the light, their crowns forming an intricate network of branches that rarely touch the ground. Within this aerial realm lives a community of species as distinct from ground-dwelling forest inhabitants as marine organisms are from terrestrial ones. Epiphytes, plants that grow on other plants without parasitizing them, festoon the branches and trunks, creating hanging gardens dozens of feet above the forest floor. In these canopy gardens, specialized pollinators, like tiny hummingbirds and butterflies, visit flowers that may bloom 100 feet above the ground. Fruits ripen in the treetops, providing food for flying mammals, birds, and arboreal creatures that rarely descend to the forest floor. Many of these canopy species possess unique adaptations for their aerial lifestyle, grasping appendages for climbing, enhanced balance organs, and behavioral patterns synchronized with the rhythms of light and wind that characterize life above the understory. The loss of the forest canopy eliminates these aerial habitats entirely. When mature forests are clear-cut, the complex three-dimensional structure that took centuries to develop disappears in a matter of days. Species adapted to life in the treetops lose not only their homes, but their entire world. Many canopy specialists cannot survive at ground level, where conditions of light, humidity, and temperature differ dramatically from their aerial realm. The middle layers of the forest, the understory trees and shrub layer, serve as critical transition zones between the bright canopy and the dark forest floor. These intermediate layers filter light, creating the dappled patterns of sun and shade that characterize the forest interior. They provide nesting sites for many bird species, foraging areas for insects and small mammals, and support networks for climbing plants that bridge the gap between ground and canopy. Many migratory birds depend on these intermediate forest layers for breeding habitat. Warblers, vireos, and tanagers have evolved specific preferences for nesting heights and vegetation densities found only in mature forest understories. The vertical stratification of bird communities in forests is so pronounced that ornithologists can often identify forest types simply by noting which species sing at different heights above the ground. When forests are cleared or severely thinned, this middle realm disappears along with the canopy. Young forest regeneration initially lacks the structural complexity of mature stands, providing simplified habitat that supports fewer species and less complex ecological interactions. Many understory specialists require decades to recolonize regenerating areas, and some may never return if the surrounding landscape lacks source populations. The forest floor itself undergoes dramatic transformation when the protective canopy is removed. Shielded by layers of leaves above, the ground layer of a mature forest maintains remarkably stable conditions. Temperatures fluctuate within narrow ranges, humidity remains high, the soil stays moist and cool, protected from direct sunlight and drying winds. This stable microclimate supports specialized communities of plants, fungi, invertebrates, and microorganisms adapted to the perpetual twilight of the forest interior. Salamanders exemplify the specialized nature of forest floor communities. These amphibians require constant moisture to survive, as they breathe partially through their permeable skin. Many species spend their entire lives within the leaf litter and soil of forest floors, feeding on tiny invertebrates and laying their eggs in moist depressions or rotting logs. The removal of forest canopy exposes these communities to temperature extremes and desiccation that can eliminate entire populations within days. The leaf litter itself represents a complex habitat layer that disappears with deforestation. This brown carpet of fallen leaves provides food and shelter for countless organisms, from bacteria and fungi that decompose organic matter to arthropods that feed on decomposing material and each other. The thickness and composition of leaf litter influences soil chemistry, moisture retention, and the cycling of nutrients throughout the forest ecosystem. Mycorrhizal fungi, which form symbiotic relationships with tree roots, create vast underground networks that connect individual trees across the forest. These fungal networks facilitate the exchange of nutrients, water, and even chemical information between trees, creating what some scientists call the wood wide web. When forests are cleared, these underground networks are severed, disrupting communication and resource sharing systems that may have operated for centuries. The loss of mature forests also eliminates the deadwood habitat that supports specialized communities of decomposer organisms. Standing dead trees, called snags, provide nesting cavities for woodpeckers, which in turn create homes for secondary cavity nesters like bluebirds, wrens, and small mammals. Fallen logs create nurse sites where tree seedlings can establish, while also providing habitat for salamanders, small mammals, and countless invertebrates. The process of forest succession following disturbance reveals both the resilience and vulnerability of forest ecosystems. In naturally disturbed forests, gaps created by fallen trees or small-scale disturbances provide opportunities for shade-intolerant species while maintaining the overall forest structure. Seeds of pioneer species, often dormant in the soil for years, germinate in these openings and begin the process of forest regeneration. However, large-scale forest clearing creates conditions very different from natural disturbance. The complete removal of canopy cover over extensive areas creates harsh microclimatic conditions that many forest species cannot tolerate. Temperatures soar during the day and plummet at night. Wind and rain directly impact the soil surface, causing erosion and compaction. Invasive plant species, often better adapted to these harsh conditions than native forest plants, frequently colonize cleared areas and prevent the reestablishment of native forest communities. Even when forests are allowed to regenerate naturally, the recovery process takes decades to centuries. Young forests provide habitat for early successional species, plants and animals adapted to disturbed environments, but they lack the structural complexity and specialized habitats of mature forests. Many old growth dependent species may never recolonize regenerating forests if the surrounding landscape lacks mature forest source populations. The fragmentation of forest habitat creates additional challenges for forest dependent species. Forest interior species require continuous canopy cover to move between habitat patches. When forests are broken up by clearings, roads, or development, these species become trapped in isolated fragments where they face the problems of small population sizes and genetic isolation discussed in earlier chapters. Edge effects penetrate deeply into fragmented forests, altering the conditions that forest interior species require. Near forest edges, increased light penetration favors the growth of weedy plants and invasive species. Wind penetration increases, creating drier conditions. Temperature fluctuations become more extreme. These edge effects can extend 300 feet or more into forest fragments, meaning that small forest patches may consist almost entirely of altered edge habitat. The loss of forest habitat affects different species groups in characteristic ways. Large mammals that require extensive territories, such as bears and large cats, are among the first to disappear from fragmented forest landscapes. Medium-sized mammals may persist in smaller forest patches, but often experience increased predation and reduced reproductive success. Many bird species show strong relationships between forest patch size and nesting success, with area-sensitive species declining rapidly as forest fragmentation increases. Insects, despite their small size, often show surprising sensitivity to forest habitat loss and fragmentation. Many forest insects have specific relationships with particular tree species or require specific microclimatic conditions found only in mature forests. The loss of these specialized insects then affects the birds, bats, and other animals that depend on them for food, creating cascading effects throughout forest food webs. Plant communities in fragmented forests face challenges related to pollination and seed dispersal. Many forest plants depend on animal pollinators that may not be able to move between isolated forest patches. Others rely on animals for seed dispersal, but the loss of forest-dwelling seed dispersers can prevent plant populations from colonizing suitable habitat patches or maintaining genetic connectivity between populations. The timing of forest loss relative to species life cycles can determine whether populations survive in fragmented landscapes. Birds that return to the same territories year after year may continue attempting to breed in degraded habitat long after conditions have become unsuitable. Long-lived trees may persist for decades in fragments too small to support breeding populations of their animal associates, creating ecological ghosts that give the illusion of intact forest function while the community gradually unravels. Climate change adds another layer of complexity to forest habitat loss. As temperature and precipitation patterns shift, the geographic ranges where different forest types can exist are changing. Species adapted to specific forest conditions may find their habitat becoming unsuitable due to climate change, just as habitat fragmentation limits their ability to disperse to more suitable areas. The regeneration of forest habitat, while possible, faces numerous challenges in fragmented landscapes. Seed sources may be distant, making natural recolonization slow or impossible. Soil conditions may have been altered by agriculture or other land uses, making them unsuitable for native forest plants. Invasive species may prevent the establishment of native forest communities. The surrounding landscape matrix may be too hostile to allow forest species to recolonize restored areas. Despite these challenges, forest restoration has become an increasingly important conservation strategy. Understanding how forest loss affects different components of forest ecosystems has led to more sophisticated approaches to forest restoration that consider not just tree planting, but the reestablishment of the complex vertical structure and species relationships that characterize healthy forest ecosystems. The story of forest habitat loss ultimately reveals the intricate nature of these complex ecosystems and the profound consequences of their destruction. When the forest canopy falls, it takes with it not just trees, but entire worlds of interconnected life that cannot exist anywhere else. Understanding these losses helps us appreciate both the magnitude of what we've lost and the importance of protecting what remains, setting the stage for examining how habitat loss affects other critical ecosystem types. Water and land meet in wetlands with a complexity that creates some of Earth's most productive and biologically diverse ecosystems. These transitional zones between terrestrial and aquatic environments support an extraordinary array of life while providing essential services to both human and natural communities. Yet wetlands have suffered disproportionate losses compared to most other habitat types, often disappearing so completely from landscapes that we forget they ever existed. The very nature of wetlands makes them both exceptionally valuable and tragically vulnerable. Defined by the presence of water at or near the surface for a significant portion of the year, wetlands include marshes, swamps, bogs, fens, and countless variations on these themes. Each type supports distinct communities of plants and animals adapted to the unique conditions created by the marriage of water and soil. In freshwater marshes, emergent vegetation like cattails and sedges creates vertical structure that extends from underwater root systems through the water column and into the air above. This three-dimensional habitat supports amphibians that require both aquatic and terrestrial environments to complete their life cycles. Frogs and salamanders lay their eggs in the water, where tadpoles and larvae develop, while adults often hunt insects in the emergent vegetation or surrounding uplands. The seasonal rhythms of wetlands create temporal niches that support species during critical life stages. Spring flooding provides breeding habitat for countless species of amphibians whose reproductive cycles are synchronized with high water levels. Summer drawdowns concentrate prey organisms and provide feeding opportunities for wading birds. Fall reflooding coincides with migration periods when millions of waterfowl depend on wetlands for food and rest. Migratory waterfowl illustrate the landscape scale importance of wetland networks. Ducks, geese, and swans follow ancient flyways that connect breeding grounds in northern regions with wintering areas in the south. Along these routes, wetlands serve as crucial stopover sites where birds can rest and refuel during their long journeys. The loss of even a single key wetland can create a gap in the chain that forces birds to attempt longer flights, potentially leading to starvation and death. The productivity of wetland ecosystems stems from their position at the interface between terrestrial and aquatic environments. Nutrients flow into wetlands from surrounding uplands, while the shallow water and abundant sunlight create ideal conditions for plant growth. Decomposing plant material forms the base of complex food webs that support everything from microscopic invertebrates to large predatory fish and birds. Wetland plants possess remarkable adaptations for life in saturated soils where oxygen levels are low. Many species have specialized tissues, called parenchyma, that transport oxygen from aerial portions of the plant to submerged roots. Others have modified root systems that can tolerate or even thrive in anaerobic conditions. These adaptations allow wetland plants to exploit a niche that few other organisms can occupy. The hydrology of wetlands, the complex patterns of water flow, storage, and cycling creates the foundation for their unique ecological functions. Natural wetlands receive water from multiple sources: direct precipitation, surface runoff from surrounding areas, groundwater discharge, and periodic flooding from connected rivers or lakes. This variable hydrology creates a dynamic environment where water levels fluctuate seasonally and between years, driving the ecological processes that support wetland communities. Wetland loss has occurred through multiple pathways, but the most common and devastating has been drainage for agricultural conversion. The rich soils of former wetlands, formed through thousands of years of plant growth and decomposition, attracted farmers who saw opportunity in these naturally fertile areas. Beginning in the 19th century and accelerating through the 20th, systematic drainage programs converted millions of acres of wetlands to farmland. The scale of wetland loss in some regions approaches the catastrophic. The prairie pothole region of the northern Great Plains, once containing millions of small wetlands formed by glacial action, has lost over half of its original wetland area. In agricultural states like Iowa, over 95% of original wetlands have been drained. California's Central Valley, once containing vast seasonal wetlands that supported millions of waterfowl, has lost over 95% of its wetland habitat to agricultural and urban development. Urban development has eliminated wetlands through filling and development, often viewing these areas as wasteland, suitable only for construction once the water has been removed. Wetlands in urban areas faced particular pressure because they were often located in valley bottoms and other areas attractive for development. The fill material used to eliminate wetlands often came from surrounding hills, creating a double impact as both wetland and upland habitats were destroyed. The loss of wetlands eliminates habitat for numerous specialized species while also disrupting the ecosystem services that wetlands provide to human communities. Wetlands function as natural water treatment systems, filtering pollutants and excess nutrients from water before it enters lakes and streams. They provide flood control by storing stormwater and releasing it slowly, reducing downstream flooding. They recharge groundwater aquifers and help maintain stream flows during dry periods. Amphibians have suffered particularly severe declines as wetland habitats have disappeared. Many amphibian species require specific types of wetlands for breeding, with some species adapted to temporary pools that fill with spring rains and dry by summer, while others need permanent water bodies. The loss of wetland breeding habitat has contributed to amphibian declines that exceed those of most other animal groups. Wetland-dependent bird species have experienced some of the steepest population declines of any group of North American birds. Species like the black tern and yellow rail have declined by over 90% as their specialized marsh habitats have disappeared. Even waterfowl, despite significant conservation efforts, have not fully recovered from the loss of breeding and migration habitat that occurred during the peak periods of wetland destruction. The interconnected nature of wetland systems means that the loss of individual wetlands can have effects that extend far beyond their boundaries. Wetlands are often connected by surface and subsurface water flows, creating networks that support regional populations of wetland-dependent species. When key wetlands in these networks are lost, the remaining wetlands may become isolated and unable to support viable populations of many species. Wetland restoration has become a major focus of conservation efforts, but recreating the complex functions of natural wetlands presents significant challenges. Restored wetlands often lack the diverse plant communities of natural systems, supporting simplified assemblages dominated by a few aggressive species. The hydrology of restored wetlands is frequently artificial, relying on pumps and controls rather than natural water sources and patterns. The timing of wetland loss relative to species life cycles can determine whether restoration efforts can recover original communities. Some wetland plants and invertebrates can recolonize restored sites from dormant seeds and eggs that persist in soil for decades. However, many animal species require continuous habitat availability and may not be able to recolonize restored wetlands if source populations have been eliminated from the surrounding landscape. Seasonal and temporary wetlands present particular conservation challenges because their value is often underappreciated. These ephemeral water bodies may appear insignificant compared to permanent lakes and marshes, but they provide critical habitat for numerous species adapted to fluctuating water levels. Many amphibians prefer temporary wetlands for breeding because they lack fish predators that would consume their eggs and larvae. The chemical pollution of remaining wetlands has emerged as a significant threat that compounds the effects of habitat loss. Agricultural runoff containing fertilizers and pesticides alters wetland communities by favoring pollution-tolerant species over sensitive natives. Urban runoff introduces road salt, heavy metals, and other contaminants that can make wetlands unsuitable for many native species. Climate change adds another dimension to wetland conservation challenges. Changing precipitation patterns and increasing temperatures are altering the hydrology of wetlands across many regions. Some wetlands are becoming drier as precipitation decreases or shifts to different seasons. Others are experiencing more extreme flooding events that can disrupt ecological communities adapted to more predictable water level fluctuations. The loss of wetland connectivity through landscape fragmentation has created additional challenges for wetland-dependent species. Many amphibians and other wetland animals move between different wetland types during their annual cycles, requiring networks of connected habitats. When wetlands become isolated by agricultural fields, roads, and development, these movement patterns are disrupted. Despite the massive losses of wetland habitat, success stories in wetland conservation demonstrate the potential for recovery when sufficient resources and political will are applied. The North American Waterfowl Management Plan has coordinated conservation efforts across international boundaries, leading to the protection and restoration of millions of acres of waterfowl habitat. These efforts have contributed to the recovery of several waterfowl species that had declined severely due to habitat loss. Constructed treatment wetlands represent an innovative approach that provides both water treatment services and wildlife habitat. These systems use wetland plants and natural processes to remove pollutants from wastewater while creating habitat for wetland species. While they cannot fully replace natural wetlands, they demonstrate how human needs and wildlife conservation can sometimes be addressed simultaneously. The conservation of remaining wetland habitats requires understanding their role in broader landscape systems. Protecting individual wetlands without considering their connections to surrounding habitats and water sources often proves insufficient for maintaining wetland functions and supporting wetland-dependent species. Watershed-scale conservation planning that considers the full range of habitats and processes affecting wetland systems offers the best hope for preserving these critical ecosystems. Wetlands represent perhaps the most dramatic example of how habitat loss can completely transform landscapes and eliminate entire categories of ecological communities. Their loss reveals the interconnected nature of ecosystem services and biodiversity conservation, showing how the destruction of habitat affects not only wildlife, but also human communities that depend on the natural services these ecosystems provide. The story of vanishing wetlands sets the stage for examining how other major habitat types have been transformed by human activities, beginning with the conversion of grasslands to agricultural production. Of all the world's major habitat types, grasslands have perhaps suffered the most complete transformation at human hands. Where vast seas of native grasses once stretched to the horizon, broken only by scattered groves and meandering streams, we now find geometric patterns of crops extending across entire continents. The conversion of grasslands to agriculture represents one of the most thorough habitat replacements in Earth's history, yet because it happened gradually over generations, we often fail to appreciate the magnitude of what has been lost. Grasslands evolved under conditions that seem paradoxical to those accustomed to thinking of fertile soil as naturally supporting forests. In the continental interiors of North America, South America, Africa, and Asia, grasslands dominated landscapes where rainfall was sufficient for plant growth, but insufficient to support closed forest canopies. These were lands shaped by fire, drought, and the thundering hooves of vast herds of grazing animals that maintained open grasslands through their feeding habits and movement patterns. The prairie ecosystems of North America exemplify the intricate relationships that evolved in grassland habitats. What appeared to early European settlers as monotonous expanses of grass actually contained hundreds of plant species arranged in complex patterns determined by subtle variations in topography, soil moisture, and drainage. Tallgrass prairies in more humid eastern regions supported grasses that grew 10 feet tall, their roots extending even deeper into rich prairie soils. Shortgrass prairies in drier western areas developed plant communities adapted to limited rainfall and periodic drought. The root systems of prairie plants reveal the hidden architecture of grassland ecosystems. While the above-ground portion of a prairie grass plant might stand 3 feet tall, its roots could extend 15 feet down into the soil, creating vast underground networks that stored carbon, cycled nutrients, and created the rich black soils that would later attract farmers. These extensive root systems allowed prairie plants to access deep groundwater during droughts, while storing enormous amounts of organic matter in the soil. prairie plant communities changed throughout the growing season in carefully orchestrated succession. Early spring brought waves of wildflowers that bloomed before the grasses began their rapid growth. Summer featured the dramatic displays of prairie grasses at their peak height, interspersed with flowering plants adapted to compete in the dense grass canopy. Fall brought different flowers and the spectacular colors of grasses curing for winter. This temporal diversity provided resources for different species throughout the growing season. The animal communities that evolved with grasslands developed remarkable adaptations for life in open landscapes. Large grazing mammals like bison created the disturbance patterns that maintained grassland structure, their selective feeding and trampling preventing the establishment of woody plants while creating microsites favorable for different plant species. Their movements across the landscape distributed nutrients and seeds, creating the patchy patterns of vegetation that supported diverse grassland communities. Smaller grassland animals evolved strategies for survival in habitats that offered little vertical structure for shelter. Ground nesting birds like meadowlarks and bobolinks developed cryptic plumage and behaviors that allowed them to blend seamlessly into their grassy surroundings. Burrowing mammals created underground cities that provided shelter from predators and extreme weather while serving as ecosystem engineers that influenced soil development and plant communities. The conversion of grasslands to agriculture began gradually but accelerated dramatically with the development of steel plows capable of breaking prairie sod. The thick root systems and tough grasses of native prairies had resisted earlier attempts at cultivation, but new technologies allowed farmers to turn the prairie under and plant crops in the fertile soils that grassland plants had been building for thousands of years. The transformation was remarkably complete. Unlike forest clearing, which often left scattered trees and woodlots in the agricultural landscape, prairie conversion typically eliminated native plant communities entirely. The moldboard plow not only buried existing vegetation, but inverted the soil profile, fundamentally altering the habitat conditions that prairie plants required. Subsequent cultivation prevented any recovery of native plant communities, creating agricultural landscapes that bore no resemblance to the original grassland ecosystems. The scale of grassland conversion defies easy comprehension. In the central United States, less than 4% of the original tallgrass prairie remains, and most remnants are tiny fragments scattered across agricultural landscapes. The loss has been even more complete in some regions, with states like Iowa and Illinois retaining less than 1% of their original prairie habitat. Similar patterns occurred globally, with the pampas of Argentina, the steppes of Eurasia, and other grassland regions experiencing comparable losses. The elimination of native grasslands created cascading effects that extended far beyond the converted areas themselves. Grassland bird populations, which had evolved with the vast continuous habitats of historic prairies, could not adapt to the fragmented agricultural landscapes that replaced them. Species like the greater prairie chicken, once numbering in the millions, declined precipitously as their habitat disappeared and became increasingly fragmented. The loss of grassland habitat eliminated not just individual species, but entire ecological processes that had operated for millennia. The fire cycles that maintained grassland structure were suppressed in agricultural areas, allowing woody plants to invade remaining grass fragments. The migration patterns of large herbivores were disrupted by fences and cultivation, ending the grazing and trampling cycles that had shaped grassland plant communities. The seasonal flooding patterns that created temporary wetlands throughout grassland landscapes were altered by drainage and cultivation. Soil organisms that had co-evolved with grassland plants also disappeared with prairie conversion. The mycorrhizal fungi that formed partnerships with prairie plant roots, helping them access nutrients and water while receiving carbohydrates in return, could not survive in agricultural soils dominated by annual crops. The complex communities of soil invertebrates that decomposed organic matter and cycled nutrients were simplified and often dominated by agricultural pests rather than native species. The timing of grassland conversion relative to scientific understanding means that we know less about original grassland ecosystems than about other habitat types. Much of the prairie conversion occurred before ecological research had documented the full complexity of grassland communities. Our understanding of what was lost often comes from studying tiny remnants that may not represent the full range of variation present in original grassland landscapes. Remaining grassland fragments face unique conservation challenges because they exist as islands in landscapes dominated by intensive agriculture. These remnants are often too small to maintain the ecological processes that grassland species require, such as fire cycles and seasonal flooding. They are vulnerable to invasion by aggressive weedy species that spread from surrounding agricultural areas. Many are affected by nutrient runoff from fertilized crops, which alters soil chemistry and favors non-native plants over native grassland species. The agricultural landscapes that replaced grasslands create hostile environments for most native grassland species. Modern farming practices involve frequent disturbance through tillage, planting, and harvesting that prevents the establishment of native plant communities. The use of herbicides eliminates any native plants that might attempt to establish in crop fields or along field margins. Pesticides reduce or eliminate the insect communities that many grassland animals depend upon for food. The simplified structure of agricultural landscapes provides little habitat value for native grassland species. Crops create temporary vegetation that lacks the year-round structure that grassland animals require. The geometric patterns of modern agriculture, with large fields and few habitat edges, provide little of the environmental heterogeneity that supported diverse grassland communities. Even programs designed to create wildlife habitat in agricultural landscapes often use non-native plants that provide limited benefits for native grassland species. Grassland restoration has proven more challenging than forest restoration in many respects. The complex plant communities of historic grasslands contain dozens of grass species and hundreds of wildflower species, creating intricate patterns of competition and cooperation that are difficult to recreate. Many prairie plants require specific soil microorganisms or mycorrhizal fungi that may no longer exist in agricultural soils. The seeds of many prairie plants require specific treatments or environmental conditions to germinate, making restoration plantings technically difficult. The restoration of grassland ecological processes presents even greater challenges than plant community restoration. Reintroducing fire to grassland remnants and restorations requires careful planning and specialized expertise, particularly in landscapes fragmented by roads and development. The large herbivores that maintained grassland structure through their grazing are extinct or present only in confined areas that bear little resemblance to their historic role in grassland ecosystems. Climate change adds another layer of complexity to grassland conservation and restoration. The precipitation patterns and temperature regimes that supported historic grassland communities are shifting, potentially making current grassland remnants unsuitable for the species they currently support. At the same time, areas that historically supported forests or other habitats may become more suitable for grassland species, but habitat fragmentation prevents species from dispersing to these newly suitable areas. Despite these challenges, grassland conservation has achieved some notable successes. Large-scale restoration projects have recreated grassland habitats that support populations of grassland birds and other native species. Conservation programs that work with farmers to create grassland habitat on marginal agricultural lands have provided benefits for both wildlife and agricultural sustainability. Private landowners have played crucial roles in grassland conservation, often maintaining prairie remnants on their property for generations. The story of grasslands under the plow reveals both the completeness with which human activities can transform landscapes and the challenges of conserving habitat types that provide few obvious economic benefits. Unlike forests, which provide timber, or wetlands, which provide water filtration services, grasslands are valued primarily for their biological diversity and their role in broader ecosystem functions. This makes their conservation particularly dependent on society's commitment to preserving natural heritage for its own sake. Understanding the loss of grassland habitats helps illuminate the broader patterns of how habitat loss affects different types of ecosystems and species. The near complete conversion of grasslands demonstrates how quickly and thoroughly human activities can eliminate habitat types that evolved over millions of years. The challenges of grassland restoration reveal the complexity of ecological relationships and the difficulty of recreating natural communities once they have been destroyed. The transformation of grasslands also illustrates how habitat loss affects different species in different ways, depending on their ecological characteristics and habitat requirements. This variation in species' vulnerability to habitat loss becomes a central theme in understanding how ecological communities respond to habitat destruction and fragmentation. Not all species face habitat loss equally. Some vanish at the first sign of disturbance, while others seem to thrive in human-modified landscapes. This variation in vulnerability reveals fundamental differences in how organisms relate to their environments and helps explain why some ecological communities collapse while others persist, albeit in altered form. Understanding these differences illuminates both the patterns of biodiversity loss we observe today and the possibilities for conservation in an increasingly human-dominated world. The characteristics that make species vulnerable to habitat loss often reflect the very adaptations that allowed them to thrive in stable, undisturbed environments. Specialist species, those with narrow habitat requirements or specific resource needs, frequently suffer the most dramatic declines when their habitats are altered. Their evolutionary success came from becoming exquisitely adapted to particular conditions, but this same specialization becomes a liability when those conditions disappear. Consider the Kirtland's warbler, a small songbird that nests exclusively in young jack pine forests in a limited area of Michigan. These birds require jack pines between 5 and 20 years old, with specific characteristics of density and ground cover. Their entire breeding population, once numbering fewer than 200 pairs, depended on forest fires that periodically created the early successional habitat they needed. When fire suppression policies eliminated natural burning cycles, the species nearly went extinct. Only intensive management, including prescribed burning and habitat creation, has allowed the population to recover. The warbler's extreme habitat specificity contrasts sharply with generalist species that can exploit a wide range of habitats and resources. The American robin, for example, thrives in environments ranging from deep forests to suburban lawns, adapting its nesting sites, food choices, and behaviors to local conditions. While robins certainly face challenges from habitat loss, their flexibility allows them to persist across landscapes where specialist species disappear. Body size plays a crucial role in determining vulnerability to habitat loss. Large animals generally require more space, more food, and often more specialized habitats than smaller species. A grizzly bear may need hundreds of square miles of suitable habitat to find enough food and mates to maintain a viable population. When habitat becomes fragmented, large animals are among the first to disappear because the remaining patches are simply too small to support them. Large predators face particular challenges because they sit at the top of food webs and require large prey populations to sustain themselves. A single mountain lion needs a territory that can support dozens of deer, which in turn require extensive areas of suitable habitat. When habitat fragmentation reduces prey populations or creates barriers to movement, predator populations become unsustainable. This explains why large carnivores have disappeared from much of their historic range, persisting only in the largest and most connected habitat areas. The relationship between body size and vulnerability extends beyond mammals to other animal groups. Large birds like eagles and condors require extensive territories and often have slow reproductive rates that make population recovery difficult once numbers decline. Large fish in rivers and lakes need connected waterways and specific spawning habitats that are easily disrupted by dams and development. Even among invertebrates, larger species tend to be more vulnerable to habitat fragmentation than smaller ones. Reproductive characteristics strongly influence how species respond to habitat loss. Species with slow reproductive rates, long generation times, and small clutch or litter sizes struggle to recover from population declines caused by habitat destruction. Many large mammals, birds of prey, and long-lived reptiles fall into this category. When habitat loss reduces their populations, these species may take decades to recover, even if suitable habitat is restored. In contrast, species with rapid reproductive rates and large numbers of offspring can sometimes recover quickly from habitat disturbances. Many small mammals, insects, and annual plants have what ecologists call weedy characteristics that allow them to colonize disturbed habitats and rebuild populations rapidly. However, even these resilient species can be overwhelmed if habitat loss occurs faster than they can adapt, or if the remaining habitat fragments become too isolated for recolonization. The dispersal abilities of species profoundly affect their vulnerability to habitat fragmentation. Species that can move easily between habitat patches may maintain viable populations even in fragmented landscapes, while poor dispersers become trapped in isolated fragments where they face the problems of small population sizes and genetic isolation. Flying animals like birds and bats might seem to have advantages in fragmented landscapes, but many species show surprising reluctance to cross even small gaps in suitable habitat. Migratory species face unique vulnerabilities because they depend on networks of suitable habitats spread across vast geographic areas. The loss of critical stopover sites can break migration routes that evolved over thousands of years. Neotropical migratory birds that breed in North America and winter in Central and South America face habitat loss throughout their ranges. A species might maintain stable breeding populations in protected northern forests, only to decline because of deforestation in distant wintering areas. The concept of ecological specialists versus generalists extends beyond habitat requirements to include dietary specialization, microclimate needs, and specific relationships with other species. Pollinators that depend on single plant species for nectar face extinction when those plants disappear, while generalist pollinators that can use many flower types may persist in modified landscapes. Similarly, animals that require specific prey species are more vulnerable than those that can switch between different food sources as availability changes. Mutualistic relationships create interdependencies that can amplify the effects of habitat loss. When one partner in a mutualistic relationship disappears, the other may follow even if suitable habitat remains available. Fig trees and their specialized wasp pollinators exemplify this vulnerability. Each fig species typically depends on a single wasp species for pollination, while the wasps can only reproduce in the fruits of their specific fig tree. The loss of either partner dooms the other, creating cascading extinctions that spread through ecological communities. Endemic species, those found nowhere else on Earth, face particular risks from habitat loss because they have no alternative populations elsewhere. Island endemics are especially vulnerable because their entire global population may be confined to a single small area. The Hawaiian tree snails, with dozens of species each adapted to specific valley systems on individual islands, have suffered massive extinctions as their forest habitats have been cleared and altered. Once a Hawaiian tree snail species goes extinct, it is gone forever, with no possibility of recolonization from other areas. Habitat specialists often evolved their narrow requirements in response to specific environmental conditions that remained stable over long periods. Old-growth forest species adapted to the consistent microclimates and structural complexity of mature forests may be unable to survive in younger forests or fragmented landscapes. Cave-dwelling species evolved in permanently dark, cool environments and cannot tolerate the temperature and light fluctuations that occur when caves are disturbed or modified. The timing of habitat loss relative to species life cycles can determine survival outcomes. Species that require multiple years to reach reproductive maturity may be eliminated by habitat disturbances that occur during critical life stages. Forest trees that take decades to mature and produce seeds may be cut down before they can reproduce, eliminating local populations permanently. Annual plants, in contrast, may be able to survive habitat disturbances as dormant seeds in the soil, waiting for suitable conditions to return. Some species show remarkable ability to adapt to human-modified landscapes, but this adaptability often comes with hidden costs. Urban-adapted birds may suffer from increased stress, reduced reproductive success, or exposure to novel diseases and pollutants. Their apparent success in cities may mask population-level problems that become evident only through careful study. Similarly, edge-adapted species that seem to benefit from forest fragmentation may face long-term challenges from increased competition, predation, or genetic isolation. The social structure of species influences their vulnerability to habitat loss in complex ways. Highly social species may be more vulnerable because they require minimum population sizes to maintain social groups necessary for feeding, protection, or reproduction. Colonial nesting birds need large populations to benefit from group vigilance and predator deterrence. Conversely, some social species may be more resilient because they can share information about new food sources or suitable habitats. Seasonal habitat requirements create additional vulnerabilities for many species. Animals that use different habitats for breeding, foraging, and overwintering may lose critical pieces of their annual cycles, even when some suitable habitat remains. Amphibians that breed in wetlands but spend most of their lives in surrounding forests can be eliminated by the loss of either habitat type. Understanding these seasonal habitat connections is crucial for effective conservation planning. The genetic diversity within species affects their ability to adapt to habitat changes. Species with high genetic diversity may contain individuals with traits that allow survival in modified habitats, while genetically uniform species may lack the variation necessary for adaptation. Small populations that have lost genetic diversity through bottlenecks or inbreeding may be particularly vulnerable to environmental changes. Climate change interactions with habitat loss create additional complications for assessing species vulnerability. Species adapted to cool, moist conditions may face a double threat as their habitats become both scarcer and less suitable due to warming temperatures. Range shifts forced by climate change may bring species into contact with new competitors, predators, or diseases for which they have no evolved defenses. Understanding patterns of vulnerability helps explain why conservation efforts succeed for some species but fail for others. Species with characteristics that make them naturally resilient to habitat loss may recover with relatively modest conservation interventions, while highly vulnerable species may require intensive, long-term management to prevent extinction. This understanding guides conservation priorities, suggesting that efforts should focus on protecting the most vulnerable species while they still have viable populations. The unequal burden of habitat loss also reveals the arbitrary nature of which species survive in human-modified landscapes. Evolutionary success under natural conditions provides no guarantee of persistence in fragmented, polluted, or otherwise modified habitats. Some of Earth's most remarkable and specialized species may be the first to disappear, while common adaptable species come to dominate simplified ecological communities. This pattern of loss impoverishes the biological heritage of our planet while creating novel ecosystems dominated by a relatively few widespread species. When habitat destruction fragments continuous landscapes into scattered remnants, each remaining patch becomes an ecological island surrounded by an ocean of altered terrain. These habitat islands follow many of the same principles that govern life on oceanic islands, but with the added complexity that their surrounding sea consists not of water, but of farms, cities, roads, and other human-dominated environments that may be hostile to the species they contain. The theory of island biogeography, developed by ecologists Robert MacArthur and E. O. Wilson in the 1960 seconds, provides a framework for understanding how habitat fragments function as ecological islands. Just as oceanic islands support fewer species than equivalent areas on continents, habitat fragments typically contain fewer species than continuous habitats of the same size. The number of species an island can support depends on its size, its isolation from other habitat patches, and the nature of the surrounding matrix. Size matters profoundly for habitat islands. Larger fragments can support larger populations, which are less vulnerable to the random fluctuations that can drive small populations extinct. They provide more diverse microhabitats and can encompass greater environmental variation, supporting species with different habitat requirements within a single fragment. Large fragments also have more interior habitat protected from the edge effects that penetrate from surrounding disturbed areas. The relationship between area and species number follows predictable mathematical patterns across many different types of habitat islands. Typically, a tenfold increase in area supports roughly twice as many species. This species area relationship means that when habitat is reduced by 90%, we can expect to lose about half the species that originally lived there, even if the remaining 10% is perfectly protected. This sobering calculation helps explain why protecting large areas is so much more effective than preserving many small ones. But the species area relationship reveals only part of the story. Not all species are equally likely to disappear as fragment size decreases. Area sensitive species, those that require large territories or extensive habitat areas to maintain viable populations, vanish first from small fragments. These often include large predators, interior forest specialists, and species with low population densities. Other species may actually increase in small fragments as they face reduced competition from the specialists that have disappeared. Isolation between habitat fragments creates barriers to the movement of individuals between populations. When populations become isolated, they lose the demographic and genetic benefits that come from immigration of individuals from other areas. Small, isolated populations face increased risk of extinction from random events like disease outbreaks, severe weather, or simple demographic bad luck, a run of years with more deaths than births or more males than females. The degree of isolation depends not just on distance between fragments, but on the nature of the intervening habitat. Some species can traverse considerable distances through hostile terrain to reach suitable habitat patches, while others are stopped by barriers that seem trivial to human observers. A four-lane highway may be an insurmountable obstacle for a forest salamander, while providing no barrier at all for a hawk soaring overhead. The surrounding matrix habitat plays a crucial role in determining how isolated habitat fragments truly are. Agricultural landscapes with hedgerows and scattered trees may allow some forest species to move between woodland fragments, while intensively managed cropland creates nearly impermeable barriers. Urban areas typically represent the most hostile matrix environments, though even cities contain corridors along streams and green spaces that can facilitate movement for some species. Edge effects penetrate into habitat fragments from the surrounding matrix, creating zones of altered environmental conditions that extend inward from fragment boundaries. These effects include changes in temperature, humidity, light levels, and wind patterns that can make fragment edges unsuitable for species adapted to interior conditions. In forest fragments, edge effects may penetrate 300 feet or more, meaning that fragments smaller than about 25 acres may consist entirely of edge habitat with no true interior conditions remaining. The shape of habitat fragments influences the ratio of edge to interior habitat. Long, narrow fragments have much more edge relative to their area than compact circular fragments. Fragments with irregular, convoluted boundaries also have high edge to interior ratios. This geometric reality means that the shape of habitat fragments can be as important as their size in determining their conservation value. Habitat islands often experience altered species interactions compared to continuous habitats. Predator-prey relationships may be disrupted if fragments are too small to support viable predator populations, leading to increases in prey species that may then overconsume their food sources. Competition may intensify in fragments as species are compressed into smaller areas. Pollination and seed dispersal networks may break down as the distances between plants and their animal partners increase. The invasion of exotic species often accelerates in fragmented habitats. Many invasive species are adapted to disturbed environments and thrive in the altered conditions found near fragment edges. Once established, they may spread into fragment interiors, gradually displacing native species and altering habitat conditions. Small fragments are particularly vulnerable to invasion because they have high edge to interior ratios and may lack the native predators and competitors that would normally control exotic species. Some habitat fragments experience what ecologists call ecological meltdown, a cascade of species losses that accelerates over time. The initial loss of area-sensitive species may reduce pollination services, seed dispersal, or predation pressure in ways that cause additional species to decline. The invasion of exotic species may further destabilize native communities. Over time, fragments may lose much of their native character and come to be dominated by weedy, opportunistic species. The quality of habitat within fragments can decline over time through various processes. Soil chemistry may change due to altered drainage patterns or nutrient inputs from surrounding agricultural areas. Microclimatic conditions may shift as edge effects penetrate deeper into fragments. Plant community composition may change as invasive species establish and spread. These qualitative changes can make fragments unsuitable for native species, even if their physical boundaries remain intact. Genetic processes in small, isolated populations create additional challenges for species persistence in habitat fragments. Inbreeding becomes more likely as population sizes decrease and individuals have fewer potential mates to choose from. Genetic drift, random changes in gene frequencies, become stronger in small populations, potentially leading to the loss of beneficial genetic variants. Over time, small populations may lose the genetic diversity they need to adapt to environmental changes or resist diseases. The concept of minimum viable population size attempts to quantify how large a population must be to persist over long time periods. Different species have very different minimum viable population sizes depending on their life history characteristics, breeding systems, and environmental variability. Some species may need only a few dozen breeding individuals to maintain viable populations, while others may require thousands. Understanding these requirements is crucial for assessing whether habitat fragments are large enough to support long-term species persistence. Metapopulation dynamics describe how collections of local populations connected by occasional migration can persist even when individual populations frequently go extinct. In fragmented landscapes, species may exist as metapopulations, with local extinctions in some habitat patches balanced by recolonization from other patches. This process requires that fragments be close enough together for occasional movement between them, but not so isolated that recolonization becomes impossible. The rescue effect occurs when immigrants from other populations prevent local populations from going extinct. Even small numbers of immigrants can significantly reduce extinction risk by providing demographic reinforcement and genetic diversity. However, the rescue effect breaks down when populations become too isolated or when all local populations decline simultaneously due to landscape scale threats. Some species show surprising resilience in fragmented landscapes, persisting in habitat patches that theory suggests should be too small or isolated to support them. These populations may benefit from resources in the surrounding matrix habitat, seasonal movements between fragments, or behavioral adaptations that allow them to use fragmented habitats more effectively than expected. Understanding how these species succeed in fragmented landscapes provides insights for conservation strategies. Habitat connectivity can be enhanced through corridors, strips of habitat that link larger fragments and facilitate movement between them. Corridors may be as simple as fence rows and hedgerows in agricultural landscapes, or as complex as wildlife overpasses that allow animals to safely cross highways. The effectiveness of corridors depends on their width, length, and habitat quality, as well as the movement requirements of the species they are intended to serve. Stepping stones, small habitat patches that provide temporary resources for animals moving between larger fragments, can also enhance connectivity in fragmented landscapes. These may be particularly important for highly mobile species that can make relatively long movements but need places to rest and refuel along the way. Even small habitat patches that cannot support breeding populations may serve valuable roles as stepping stones. The matrix habitat itself can sometimes be managed to be more permeable to native species movement. Agricultural practices that maintain hedgerows, reduce pesticide use, and create buffer strips along waterways can make farmland more hospitable to wildlife movement. Urban planning that incorporates green corridors and preserves natural features can reduce the isolation of habitat fragments in developed landscapes. Conservation strategies in fragmented landscapes must balance the competing demands of protecting existing fragments while working to restore connectivity and create new habitat. The prioritization of conservation efforts requires understanding which fragments are most important for maintaining viable populations and which corridors would provide the greatest benefits for connectivity. This often involves difficult trade-offs between protecting high-quality fragments and restoring degraded areas that could serve as stepping stones or corridors. The study of habitat islands has revealed fundamental principles about how species respond to habitat loss and fragmentation. These insights guide conservation planning in human-dominated landscapes and help predict which species are most likely to persist as habitat destruction continues. Understanding island biogeography has become essential for conservation biology, providing both sobering predictions about species losses and hopeful strategies for maintaining biodiversity in fragmented worlds. The destruction of a single wetland may seem like a localized tragedy, affecting only the ducks and frogs that lived there. But ecological systems are interconnected in ways that can make local habitat loss reverberate through networks spanning continents. A marsh drained in Saskatchewan may contribute to the decline of shorebirds wintering in Argentina. A patch of prairie flowers eliminated by development may reduce pollination services for crops hundreds of miles away. These distant connections reveal how habitat loss creates cascading effects that spread far beyond the boundaries of the destroyed areas themselves. Ecological networks, the complex webs of relationships that connect species across landscapes, transmit the effects of habitat loss through pathways that are often invisible until they break. Consider the network of relationships centered around a single wildflower species. That flower depends on specific pollinators for reproduction, while the pollinators depend on a sequence of flowering plants that bloom throughout the growing season. Birds that eat the flower's seeds may cache some in distant locations, effectively planting new populations. The nutrients from the flower's decomposing tissues feed soil organisms that support the root systems of nearby trees. When habitat destruction eliminates this wildflower from part of its range, the effects ripple outward through each connection in the network. Pollinators lose a food source and may decline in abundance, reducing pollination services for other plants. Seed dispersing birds must find alternative food sources or face nutritional stress during critical periods. Soil communities lose an input of organic matter and may shift toward different compositions that favor different plant species. The strength of these cascading effects depends on how specialized the relationships are and whether alternative resources exist. If the eliminated wildflower was one of many similar species that bloom at the same time, its loss might barely register in the broader community. But if it was the only source of nectar available during a critical period, or if it provided unique chemical compounds that certain insects require, its disappearance could trigger a cascade of secondary extinctions. Some species play disproportionately important roles in maintaining ecological networks. These keystone species have effects on their communities that far exceed what their abundance alone would suggest. The classic example is the sea otter of Pacific kelp forests. Sea otters prey on sea urchins, which graze on kelp. Where otters are absent, urchin populations explode and overgraze the kelp, transforming diverse kelp forest communities into barren urchin barrens that support far fewer species. The loss of keystone species through habitat destruction can trigger ecological cascades that restructure entire communities. When wolves were eliminated from Yellowstone National Park in the early 20th century, deer populations increased dramatically. The increased browsing pressure from deer prevented the regeneration of aspen and willow trees along streams, which changed erosion patterns and altered aquatic habitats. Stream channels became wider and shallower, affecting fish populations and the birds that depend on them. The reintroduction of wolves decades later allowed tree regeneration to resume and stream channels to return to their previous patterns. Habitat loss can disrupt keystone species in multiple ways. Direct habitat destruction may eliminate the species entirely from an area. Habitat fragmentation may reduce population sizes below the levels needed to maintain their ecological roles. Changes in habitat quality may reduce the effectiveness of their key functions even when the species persists. Understanding these disruptions requires looking beyond individual species to consider their roles in broader ecological networks. Foundation species create the physical structure that supports entire communities, and their loss through habitat destruction can cause complete ecosystem collapse. Old-growth trees and forests, reef-building corals and marine systems, and prairie grasses and grassland ecosystems all serve as foundation species that create habitat for hundreds of other species. When habitat loss eliminates foundation species, it removes not just individual organisms, but the entire three-dimensional structure that supports ecological communities. The loss of foundation species often cannot be quickly reversed, even when habitat protection or restoration efforts begin. It may take centuries for new old-growth forests to develop the structural complexity that supports specialized forest communities. Coral reefs destroyed by coastal development may never recover if the physical and chemical conditions that allowed reef growth have been permanently altered. Prairie grasslands converted to agriculture lose the deep soil organic matter that took thousands of years to accumulate, making restoration to original conditions extremely difficult. Pollination networks illustrate how habitat loss can disrupt ecological services that extend far beyond the destroyed habitats themselves. Many crops depend on wild pollinators that nest in natural habitats, but forage across landscapes that include agricultural areas. The destruction of nesting habitat for native bees may reduce pollination services for both wild plants and crops over areas much larger than the destroyed habitat itself. The timing of habitat loss can determine the magnitude of cascading effects through pollination networks. The elimination of early blooming wildflowers may force pollinators to travel greater distances to find food during critical periods when they are building energy reserves for reproduction. This can reduce reproductive success, even for pollinators that find adequate food later in the season. Similarly, the loss of late season flowers may prevent pollinators from accumulating the energy reserves they need to survive winter. Migratory species create some of the most far-reaching connections in ecological networks. A bird that breeds in Canadian forests, stops over in Great Plains wetlands during migration, and winters in Central American coffee plantations connects habitats across an entire hemisphere. Habitat loss anywhere along this chain can affect populations throughout the species range. The drainage of a single stopover wetland may force birds to attempt longer flights between remaining sites, leading to mortality that reduces breeding populations thousands of miles away. The collapse of migratory networks can have cascading effects on the ecosystems that migratory species connect. Many migratory birds transport nutrients from aquatic wintering areas to terrestrial breeding areas, effectively subsidizing forest productivity with marine-derived nutrients. When habitat loss disrupts these migrations, it can reduce nutrient inputs to northern forests and alter their productivity and species composition. Seed dispersal networks face similar vulnerabilities to habitat loss. Many plants depend on animals to transport their seeds to suitable germination sites, often over considerable distances. Large-seeded plants that depend on large mammals for dispersal have suffered particularly severe disruptions, as habitat loss has eliminated their dispersal agents from much of their range. Without effective seed dispersal, plant populations become increasingly isolated and unable to colonize new areas or recolonize sites where local populations have gone extinct. The loss of seed dispersal services can create feedback loops that accelerate habitat degradation. Plants that cannot disperse effectively may become increasingly confined to small areas where they face heightened competition and vulnerability to local disturbances. The reduced plant diversity that results may make habitats less resilient to further disturbances and less able to support the animal communities that provide dispersal services. Predator-prey networks transmit the effects of habitat loss through trophic cascades, changes in predator abundance that cascade down through multiple levels of the food web. The elimination of top predators through habitat loss can release their prey from predation pressure, leading to increases in herbivore populations that may then overconsume vegetation. This can trigger cascading changes in plant communities that affect soil stability, nutrient cycling, and habitat structure for many other species. The strength of trophic cascades depends on the complexity of food webs and the degree of specialization in predator-prey relationships. Simple food webs with few predator species may show strong cascading effects when key predators are lost. Complex food webs with many alternative predators and prey may be more resilient to the loss of individual species, but they can also transmit disturbances through multiple pathways simultaneously. Disease transmission networks can amplify the effects of habitat loss in unexpected ways. Habitat fragmentation may increase disease transmission by forcing animals into closer contact or by increasing stress levels that reduce immune function. Conversely, the loss of certain habitat types may eliminate disease reservoirs or vector species, potentially reducing disease pressure on remaining populations. Understanding these disease dynamics requires considering the full network of hosts, vectors, and environmental conditions that influence pathogen transmission. The disruption of natural pest control networks represents one of the most economically significant cascading effects of habitat loss. Many agricultural pests are controlled by predators and parasites that depend on natural habitats for part of their life cycles. The destruction of these habitats can release pest populations from natural control, leading to increased crop damage and greater reliance on chemical pesticides. This creates a feedback loop where agricultural intensification drives further habitat loss while reducing the ecosystem services that natural habitats provide to agriculture. Climate regulation networks may be among the most important cascading effects of habitat loss, though they are often the least visible. Forests influence local and regional climate through their effects on temperature, humidity, and precipitation patterns. The loss of large forest areas can alter rainfall patterns that affect ecosystems and human communities far from the deforested areas. Wetlands influence flood control and water quality across entire watersheds, so their loss can increase flooding and water pollution in distant downstream areas. The restoration of ecological networks faces unique challenges because it requires coordinating conservation efforts across large landscapes and multiple jurisdictions. Protecting a single large habitat area may not be sufficient if the species it contains depend on resources or habitat types located elsewhere. Effective network conservation often requires protecting habitat corridors, maintaining connectivity between distant areas, and considering the full range of habitats that species use during their annual cycles. Understanding cascading effects also reveals opportunities for conservation strategies that provide benefits far beyond their immediate scope. Protecting key stopover sites for migratory species can benefit populations across entire flyways. Maintaining pollinator habitat can support both wild plant communities and agricultural production across large landscapes. Preserving foundation species can maintain the habitat structure that supports entire ecological communities. The butterfly effect of habitat loss reminds us that ecological systems are fundamentally interconnected and that seemingly local actions can have far-reaching consequences. As habitat destruction continues to break apart these ancient networks, we lose not only individual species and places, but the intricate web of relationships that has sustained life on Earth for millions of years. Twice each year, billions of animals embark on journeys that span continents and oceans, following routes that have been refined over millions of years of evolution. These migrations represent some of the most remarkable phenomena in the natural world, connecting distant ecosystems and creating biological rhythms that pulse across the planet. Yet these ancient pathways are increasingly disrupted as habitat loss eliminates the critical stopover sites that make long-distance migration possible. Migration evolved as a strategy for exploiting resources that vary in availability across space and time. Rather than remaining in one location year-round and enduring periods of scarcity, migratory species follow the seasonal abundance of food, suitable climate, and breeding opportunities. This strategy allows them to access resources from multiple ecosystems and often supports much larger populations than would be possible if they remained sedentary. The Arctic tern exemplifies the extremes to which migration can extend. These remarkable birds breed in the Arctic summer, then fly to Antarctic waters to take advantage of the southern hemisphere summer, completing an annual round trip of roughly 44,000 miles. In doing so, they experience more daylight than any other animal on Earth and access productive marine ecosystems at both poles. Their migration connects the Arctic and Antarctic in ways that few other species can achieve. For most migratory species, the journey between breeding and wintering areas requires multiple stops for rest and refueling. These stopover sites are as critical to successful migration as fuel stations are to long-distance travel. Birds must accumulate energy reserves at each stop to power the next segment of their journey, while also finding safe places to rest and avoid predators. The loss of key stopover sites can turn manageable journeys into impossible ordeals. Shorebirds provide some of the most dramatic examples of dependence on specific stopover sites. The red knot, a robin-sized sandpiper, breeds in the Canadian Arctic and winters as far south as Argentina. During migration, the entire population converges on Delaware Bay in late May, where they depend almost exclusively on the eggs of horseshoe crabs for the energy needed to complete their journey to Arctic breeding grounds. The timing is crucial. The birds arrive just as horseshoe crabs are spawning, providing a brief but enormous pulse of high-energy food. This dependence on a single stopover site makes red knots extremely vulnerable to habitat loss and degradation. Overharvesting of horseshoe crabs for medical and industrial uses has reduced the availability of crab eggs precisely when the birds need them most. Coastal development has eliminated beach habitats where crabs spawn. The result has been a dramatic decline in red knot populations, demonstrating how the loss of a single critical habitat can affect species across their entire range. Wetlands serve as crucial stopover sites for countless migratory species, but they have been destroyed at alarming rates across migration routes. The prairie pothole region of North America, which historically contained millions of small wetlands, has lost over half of its original wetland area to agricultural conversion. Each lost wetland represents one fewer refueling stop for waterfowl traveling between Arctic breeding grounds and southern wintering areas. The spacing of stopover sites along migration routes reflects the physiological limitations of migrating animals. Most songbirds can fly continuously for only 12 to 18 hours before they must stop to rest and refuel. This means they need suitable habitat roughly every 300 to 500 miles along their migration routes. When stopover sites are destroyed, birds may be forced to attempt flights that exceed their physiological capabilities, leading to exhaustion and death. The quality of stopover sites matters as much as their presence. Migrants arrive at stopover sites in varying degrees of exhaustion and fat depletion. High-quality sites allow rapid energy accumulation and quick turnaround times, while poor-quality sites may require longer stays that increase exposure to predators and adverse weather. Degraded sites may actually function as ecological traps, appearing suitable but providing insufficient resources for successful migration. Urban development and agricultural intensification have reduced the quality of many remaining stopover sites. Light pollution from cities disorients nocturnal migrants, often causing them to collide with buildings or become trapped in urban areas where they cannot find adequate food or shelter. Pesticide use in agricultural areas eliminates the insects that many migrants depend upon for food. Habitat fragmentation forces migrants to search larger areas to find sufficient resources. The phenomenon known as the green wave illustrates how migrants track seasonal changes in food availability across landscapes. As spring advances northward, the timing of plant growth and insect emergence follows predictable patterns. Migrants time their movements to coincide with peak food availability at each stop along their route. Climate change is disrupting these carefully synchronized patterns, causing mismatches between migration timing and resource availability. Some stopover sites support staggering concentrations of migrants during peak passage periods. The Copper River Delta in Alaska hosts millions of shorebirds during spring migration, representing perhaps 20% of the world's entire shorebird population during a brief 2-week period. The Bosque del Apache in New Mexico provides critical winter habitat for sandhill cranes, with tens of thousands of birds roosting in a single area. The loss of such concentration sites would have devastating effects on multiple species simultaneously. Riparian corridors, the strips of vegetation along rivers and streams, serve as natural migration highways for many species. These corridors provide water, food, and shelter while creating connected pathways across otherwise inhospitable terrain. The destruction of riparian vegetation for agriculture and development has eliminated many of these natural corridors, forcing migrants to cross larger expanses of unsuitable habitat. Mountain ridges create another type of migration corridor, particularly for raptors that depend on thermal updrafts for energy-efficient soaring flight. Hawks, eagles, and vultures follow these ridgelines during migration, concentrating at specific points where geographic features create favorable wind conditions. Wind energy development along these ridges can create deadly obstacles for migrating raptors, while habitat destruction in surrounding valleys eliminates foraging areas. Coastal migration routes face particular pressures from human development. Many birds follow coastlines during migration, using beaches, salt marshes, and nearshore waters for feeding and resting. Coastal development for tourism, ports, and urban expansion has eliminated much of the natural habitat along these routes. Sea level rise associated with climate change threatens to eliminate many remaining coastal stopover sites. The timing of habitat loss relative to migration cycles can determine its severity. Stopover sites destroyed during peak migration periods may cause immediate mortality as migrants arrive to find their expected resources unavailable. Sites destroyed during off-peak periods may allow species to gradually shift to alternative routes, though this adaptation may take many generations to accomplish. International migration creates unique conservation challenges because species depend on habitats in multiple countries that may have very different conservation priorities and capabilities. A bird that breeds in Canada, stops over in the United States during migration, and winters in Mexico depends on conservation efforts in all three countries. The failure of any one country to protect critical habitats can doom the entire population. Flyway conservation initiatives attempt to coordinate habitat protection across entire migration routes. The North American Bird Conservation Initiative brings together government agencies, conservation organizations, and private partners from Canada, the United States, and Mexico to protect migratory bird habitat. Similar partnerships exist for the East Asian Australasian flyway and other major migration routes. The concept of bottlenecks helps identify the most critical sites for flyway conservation. Bottlenecks are locations where large portions of migratory populations concentrate, making them vulnerable but also creating opportunities for efficient conservation. Protecting a single bottleneck site may benefit a much larger population than protecting multiple sites that support smaller numbers of migrants. Climate change is shifting the geographic ranges of many species, potentially making current migration routes obsolete while creating needs for new stopover sites. Species that have evolved to migrate between specific latitudes may find that suitable climate conditions have shifted to different longitudes. This three-dimensional puzzle of changing habitat suitability presents unprecedented challenges for migration conservation. Some species show remarkable flexibility in adjusting migration routes and stopover sites in response to habitat changes. Others appear rigidly programmed to follow traditional routes, even when they no longer provide adequate resources. Understanding these differences in behavioral flexibility helps predict which species may be able to adapt to changing landscapes and which may face extinction as their traditional routes become unusable. The restoration of stopover habitat has become a critical component of migration conservation. Creating new wetlands, restoring riparian corridors, and managing agricultural lands to provide migration resources can help offset losses elsewhere. However, restoration efforts must consider the complex requirements of multiple species and the precise timing of their habitat needs throughout the migration season. Urban environments are increasingly being managed to support migrating species. Cities along major flyways are implementing bird-friendly building designs, reducing light pollution during migration periods, and creating green spaces that provide urban oases for migrants. While urban habitats cannot fully replace natural stopover sites, they can provide valuable supplemental resources in landscapes where natural habitat is scarce. The loss of migration stopover sites represents one of the most geographically extensive impacts of habitat destruction. Unlike local habitat loss that affects only nearby species, the destruction of stopover sites can influence populations across entire continents. Understanding and protecting these critical links in migration chains becomes essential as landscapes continue to change and climate change adds new pressures to ancient migration systems. The landscapes of Earth are in motion. As global temperatures rise and precipitation patterns shift, the geographic zones where different species can survive are moving across the planet like slow-motion waves. Forests creep northward and upslope, seeking cooler temperatures. Deserts expand into areas that once supported grasslands. Coastal habitats disappear beneath rising seas. This climate-driven reshuffling of habitats would present challenges enough on its own, but it occurs against a backdrop of unprecedented habitat destruction that blocks the pathways species need to follow their shifting climate zones. Temperature and precipitation patterns have always fluctuated across geological time, driving species to track suitable conditions across landscapes. During ice ages, temperate forest retreated southward as glaciers advanced, then expanded northward again as the climate warmed. Species that could disperse effectively followed their preferred conditions, while those that could not faced extinction. The critical difference today is the speed of change and the fragmented nature of the landscapes through which species must move. Climate change is occurring roughly 10 times faster than the natural rate at which most tree species can migrate. While oaks and maples might naturally disperse their seeds a few hundred yards per year, the climate zones suitable for these species are shifting northward at rates of several miles per year. This creates a fundamental mismatch between the pace of environmental change and the ability of many species to respond. Only the most dispersive species can keep up with the shifting conditions on their own. Mountain ecosystems face particularly severe challenges because climate zones are compressed into narrow elevational bands. A temperature increase that might allow species to migrate hundreds of miles north on level ground may push mountain species only a few hundred feet upslope before they run out of habitat entirely. Alpine species adapted to cool, moist conditions at high elevations may find themselves stranded on mountaintops as warming temperatures make lower elevations unsuitable. The American pika, a small mammal related to rabbits, illustrates the plight of high elevation species. Pikas live in rocky talus slopes in western North American mountains, where they are adapted to cool temperatures and collect plants throughout the summer to dry into hay piles for winter food. As temperatures warm, suitable habitat moves upslope, but pikas are poor dispersers with limited ability to cross the valleys between mountain ranges. Populations on isolated peaks face local extinction with no opportunity for rescue from other areas. Coastal species face the dual challenge of sea level rise and coastal development that eliminates potential retreat routes. Salt marshes, which provide critical habitat for specialized birds, fish, and invertebrates, cannot simply migrate inland when sea levels rise because coastal development blocks their landward movement. Instead, they become squeezed between rising waters and human infrastructure, a phenomenon ecologists call coastal squeeze. The timing of biological events is becoming increasingly mismatched with environmental conditions as climate change disrupts seasonal patterns. Many species have evolved to time their reproduction, migration, or other activities with predictable environmental cues like temperature or day length. As these cues become unreliable indicators of actual conditions, species may find themselves attempting to breed when food is scarce or migrating when weather conditions are unsuitable. Migratory birds that time their spring arrival based on day length may reach breeding grounds before insect populations have emerged, leaving them with inadequate food during the critical period when they need energy for egg production and chick rearing. Conversely, plants that flower in response to warming temperatures may bloom before their pollinators become active, disrupting pollination networks that have operated successfully for millennia. These phenological mismatches, timing mismatches between interacting species, can have cascading effects throughout ecological communities. When the peak abundance of caterpillars no longer coincides with the period when baby birds need protein-rich food, reproductive success declines and populations begin to shrink. When flowers bloom before their pollinators emerge, both plants and pollinators suffer reduced reproductive success. Climate change also alters the intensity and frequency of disturbance events that many ecosystems depend upon. Fire regimes are shifting as temperatures rise and precipitation patterns change, with many areas experiencing more frequent and severe wildfires. Some species adapted to periodic fire may benefit from increased burning, while others that require long fire-free intervals may be eliminated by too frequent burns. Drought stress is increasing in many regions, making forests more susceptible to insect outbreaks and disease. Mountain pine beetles, once controlled by cold winter temperatures that killed overwintering larvae, are now surviving in areas where they historically could not persist. The result has been massive die-offs of pine forests across western North America, eliminating habitat for species that depend on living trees while creating new habitat for species adapted to dead wood. Precipitation changes affect freshwater habitats in complex ways. Some regions are experiencing increased flooding that can wash away streamside vegetation and disrupt aquatic communities. Others face prolonged droughts that reduce stream flows and eliminate temporary wetlands that many species depend upon for breeding. The increased variability in precipitation patterns makes it difficult for species to predict and adapt to changing conditions. Ocean acidification, caused by increased carbon dioxide absorption by seawater, is altering marine habitats in fundamental ways. Coral reefs, which support perhaps 25% of all marine species despite covering less than 1% of ocean area, are experiencing widespread bleaching events as warming waters stress the symbiotic algae that provide corals with energy. Acidification makes it more difficult for corals and other marine organisms to build and maintain calcium carbonate structures. The interaction between climate change and habitat fragmentation creates what conservation biologists call a double jeopardy for many species. Climate change creates pressure for species to move to new areas, while habitat fragmentation eliminates or degrades the pathways they need for movement. Species trapped in habitat fragments may face local extinction as conditions become unsuitable, with no opportunity to disperse to areas where conditions remain favorable. Corridors designed to facilitate movement between habitat fragments become even more important under climate change scenarios. These pathways must be oriented in directions that allow species to track shifting climate zones, typically north-south in temperate regions and upslope-downslope in mountainous areas. Corridors that connect only similar habitats may become less useful if climate change makes those habitats unsuitable throughout their current range. The concept of climate refugia, areas that remain relatively stable as climate changes, is becoming central to conservation planning. These refugia may include areas buffered by large water bodies, north-facing slopes that remain cool, or valleys that channel cool air downslope. Protecting climate refugia and ensuring connectivity to them may be crucial for maintaining populations during periods of rapid climate change. Some species are already showing remarkable adaptability to changing climate conditions. Their ranges are shifting northward and upslope as predicted, and some are even evolving rapidly in response to new selective pressures. Migratory birds are adjusting their timing to match changing seasonal patterns. Plants are flowering earlier in response to warming temperatures. These adaptations provide hope that some species can cope with climate change, at least initially. However, many species show concerning inflexibility in their responses to changing conditions. Some continue to follow traditional migration routes and timing even when conditions along those routes have become unsuitable. Others appear unable to recognize or utilize novel habitats that might provide suitable conditions. The ability to adapt behaviorally and evolutionarily to rapid environmental change varies enormously among species. Human-assisted migration is emerging as a controversial but potentially necessary conservation strategy for some species. This involves deliberately moving species to areas outside their current range, where climate models predict suitable conditions will develop. While such interventions carry risks of creating invasive species problems, they may be the only option for species that cannot disperse quickly enough on their own. Urban environments are becoming increasingly important as climate refugia and stepping stones for species movement. Cities often contain diverse microclimates and novel habitat types that may provide opportunities for species displaced by climate change. Urban heat islands can provide warm microclimates that may benefit species moving northward, while urban water features can provide critical resources during droughts. The restoration of degraded habitats takes on new urgency under climate change scenarios. Restored habitats can provide stepping stones that facilitate species movement across fragmented landscapes. They can also serve as refugia, where species can persist while waiting for suitable conditions to develop elsewhere. Climate informed restoration considers not just current species needs, but projected future conditions. Dynamic conservation strategies that anticipate future habitat needs are replacing static approaches focused only on current conditions. These strategies recognize that the habitats we need to protect in the future may be different from those that are most important today. They emphasize maintaining landscape connectivity and heterogeneity rather than preserving specific community compositions. The interaction between climate change and habitat loss is fundamentally altering the rules that have governed ecosystem dynamics for millions of years. The stable relationships between species and their environments that evolution has fine tuned are being disrupted faster than natural adaptation can respond. Understanding these interactions becomes crucial for developing conservation strategies that can help species and ecosystems navigate an increasingly uncertain future. Climate change transforms habitat loss from a primarily local or regional issue into a global phenomenon that affects every ecosystem on Earth. The mosaic of habitats that has supported life's diversity is shifting faster than many species can follow, creating new challenges that require innovative approaches to conservation and ecosystem management. Behind every cleared forest and drained wetland lies an economic calculation. Someone, somewhere, decided that the immediate financial benefits of converting natural habitat outweighed the costs of leaving it intact. These decisions, made by individuals, corporations, and governments around the world, have created the patterns of habitat loss we see today. Understanding the economic forces that drive habitat destruction reveals both why natural areas continue to disappear and how economic tools might be redirected to support conservation. The fundamental challenge in habitat conservation is that many of the benefits natural ecosystems provide are invisible to traditional economic accounting. When a developer clears a forest to build houses, the economic benefits are immediate and obvious: land sales, construction jobs, property taxes, and retail opportunities. The economic costs of forest loss, reduced air and water quality, lost carbon storage, diminished wildlife habitat, and decreased flood control are diffuse, delayed, and difficult to quantify in monetary terms. This mismatch between immediate visible benefits and long-term hidden costs creates a systematic bias toward habitat destruction in economic decision-making. Economists call this the problem of externalities, costs or benefits that affect parties not directly involved in a transaction. When a farmer drains a wetland to plant crops, the benefits accrue directly to the farmer, while the costs: lost flood control, reduced water quality, and eliminated wildlife habitat are borne by society as a whole. The tragedy of the commons, first described by economist Garrett Hardin, helps explain why shared natural resources often become overexploited. When multiple parties have access to a common resource, each has an incentive to use as much as possible before others take it, even when everyone would benefit from restraint. This dynamic drives overfishing, overgrazing, and the exploitation of other shared natural resources that provide habitat for wildlife. Short term thinking embedded in financial systems exacerbates the bias toward habitat destruction. Investment decisions are typically evaluated based on returns over periods of years or decades, while many ecosystem benefits accrue over centuries. A forest's value as carbon storage and climate regulation may far exceed its timber value when calculated over a century, but financial markets rarely consider such long time horizons. The pressure for quarterly profits drives decisions that maximize immediate returns while ignoring long term consequences. Land tenure systems strongly influence habitat conservation outcomes. In many parts of the world, unclear or insecure property rights create incentives for rapid resource extraction rather than long term stewardship. When people cannot be certain they will control land in the future, they have little reason to invest in its long term productivity or conservation. Conversely, secure land tenure can provide incentives for sustainable management, though it does not guarantee conservation outcomes. The global nature of modern markets means that habitat destruction in one part of the world may be driven by demand thousands of miles away. Soybeans grown on cleared Amazon rainforest land may feed livestock in Europe. Palm oil from converted Indonesian forests may end up in processed foods sold in North America. These global supply chains disconnect consumers from the environmental consequences of their purchasing decisions while making it difficult to assign responsibility for habitat loss. Subsidies and government policies often inadvertently encourage habitat destruction. Agricultural subsidies that pay farmers based on the amount of land under cultivation create incentives to clear natural areas for farming. Tax policies that treat land clearing as an improvement can make habitat destruction financially attractive. Flood insurance that covers development in flood-prone wetlands removes market incentives for avoiding these sensitive areas. The concept of ecosystem services attempts to make the economic value of natural systems visible by quantifying the benefits they provide in monetary terms. Forests provide services like carbon sequestration, air purification, water filtration, and erosion control that would be extremely expensive to replace with human-built infrastructure. Wetlands provide flood control, water treatment, and storm protection services that save billions of dollars in potential damages. Pollination services provided by wild bees and other insects represent one of the most quantifiable ecosystem services. These services are worth billions of dollars annually to agriculture, yet the habitat that supports pollinators continues to disappear. The economic value of pollination becomes apparent only when it is lost. California almond growers now pay beekeepers hundreds of dollars per hive to provide pollination services that wild bees once provided for free. Natural pest control services provided by birds, bats, and beneficial insects save agriculture enormous amounts that would otherwise be spent on pesticides. A single barn owl can consume thousands of rodents per year, providing pest control worth hundreds of dollars per owl. Bats in agricultural areas consume insect pests worth billions of dollars in crop protection annually. Yet the habitat these natural pest controllers require continues to be eliminated. The tourism value of natural areas often exceeds the short-term value of their conversion to other uses. Wildlife viewing, hunting, fishing, and nature photography generate billions of dollars in economic activity while leaving ecosystems largely intact. Costa Rica's transition from an economy based on forest clearing to one based on ecotourism demonstrates how conservation can become economically attractive when ecosystem services and tourism values are properly accounted for. Bioprospecting, the search for commercially valuable compounds in natural systems, represents another source of economic value from intact ecosystems. Many pharmaceuticals, including aspirin, antibiotics, and cancer treatments, were originally derived from natural compounds. The potential for discovering new medicines, industrial compounds, and agricultural products in unexplored ecosystems provides an economic argument for conservation, though this value is speculative and difficult to quantify. Carbon markets represent one of the most significant recent developments in creating economic incentives for habitat conservation. By putting a price on carbon emissions and allowing trading of carbon credits, these markets create financial incentives for maintaining forests and other carbon storing ecosystems. Costa Rica's Payments for Ecosystem Services program compensates landowners for maintaining forest cover, while Indonesia has experimented with paying communities to protect peat bogs that store enormous amounts of carbon. However, carbon markets face significant challenges in ensuring that habitat conservation actually occurs. Verification that promised conservation activities are taking place requires expensive monitoring systems. Leakage can occur when habitat destruction simply shifts to other areas not covered by conservation programs. Permanence is difficult to guarantee. Forests protected under carbon programs may be cut down years later if economic conditions change. Green accounting methods attempt to incorporate ecosystem values into national economic statistics. Traditional measures, like gross domestic product, count habitat destruction as economic growth, while ignoring the loss of ecosystem services. Alternative measures that account for natural capital provide a more accurate picture of whether economic development is truly increasing societal wealth or simply converting one form of capital into another. The insurance industry is beginning to recognize the economic value of natural systems for disaster risk reduction. Coastal wetlands and coral reefs provide storm surge protection that reduces hurricane damage to coastal communities. Forests reduce flood risks by slowing runoff and stabilizing soils. As climate change increases the frequency and severity of natural disasters, the insurance value of ecosystem services becomes increasingly apparent to financial markets. Environmental bonds and other innovative financial instruments are creating new ways to fund habitat conservation. Green bonds allow investors to fund conservation projects while receiving financial returns. Conservation easements compensate landowners for agreeing to limit development on their property. Debt for nature swaps allow developing countries to reduce their foreign debt in exchange for conservation commitments. Corporate sustainability initiatives are beginning to address habitat loss in supply chains, though progress remains limited. Some companies are adopting zero deforestation policies for their agricultural suppliers or committing to use only sustainably produced materials. Consumer pressure and investor demands for environmental responsibility are slowly creating market incentives for habitat conservation, though these remain weak compared to traditional cost considerations. The emerging field of natural capital accounting attempts to systematically measure and value ecosystem services as a basis for economic decision making. This involves developing standardized methods for quantifying ecosystem services, creating markets where these services can be bought and sold, and integrating ecosystem values into business and government accounting systems. While promising, these approaches face significant technical and political challenges. Payment for ecosystem services programs directly compensate landowners for maintaining habitats that provide valuable services. These programs can make conservation financially competitive with alternative land uses by ensuring that ecosystem benefits are captured by those who provide them. Successful programs require clear definition of the services being purchased, reliable monitoring systems, and sufficient funding to make conservation attractive. The discount rate used in economic analysis profoundly affects how ecosystem values compare to immediate development benefits. When future benefits are heavily discounted, short-term gains from habitat conversion will always appear more attractive than long-term ecosystem services. Lower discount rates that reflect the true social cost of time make conservation more economically attractive by giving appropriate weight to future benefits. Regulatory approaches can internalize the costs of habitat destruction by requiring developers to pay for the ecosystem services they eliminate. Wetland mitigation banking requires developers who destroy wetlands to pay for the creation or restoration of equivalent wetlands elsewhere. Biodiversity offsets extend this principle to other types of habitat, requiring that habitat destruction be balanced by habitat creation. The economic case for habitat conservation strengthens as ecosystem services become scarcer and more valuable. As natural systems become increasingly degraded, the replacement cost of their services grows. Clean water becomes more expensive as watersheds are developed. Flood control becomes more costly as wetlands disappear. Pollination services become more expensive as wild pollinator populations decline. Understanding the economics of habitat loss reveals that conservation is not simply an environmental issue, but an economic necessity for long-term human prosperity. The challenge lies in developing economic systems that properly account for ecosystem values and create appropriate incentives for habitat conservation. As these economic tools mature and develop, they offer hope for aligning economic incentives with conservation goals. In landscapes fractured by habitat loss, thin lines of green offer lifelines for wildlife struggling to survive in increasingly isolated fragments. These corridors, strips of natural habitat that connect larger patches, represent one of conservation's most promising strategies for maintaining biodiversity in human-dominated landscapes. Yet, creating effective corridors requires understanding not just where to place them, but how different species use the landscape and what constitutes truly functional connectivity. The concept of habitat corridors emerged from island biogeography theory and observations of how animals move through fragmented landscapes. Early researchers noticed that species were more likely to persist in habitat fragments that remained connected to other patches than in isolated fragments of similar size. This suggested that maintaining connections between habitats might be as important as protecting the habitats themselves. Riparian corridors, the strips of vegetation along rivers and streams, provide some of the most natural examples of habitat connectivity. These ribbons of trees and shrubs weave through landscapes, connecting distant forest patches and providing pathways for movement across otherwise inhospitable terrain. Many species use riparian corridors as highways, following them during dispersal and migration, while also utilizing the unique resources they provide. The effectiveness of corridors depends critically on their design and the species they are intended to serve. Wide corridors function more like linear habitats, supporting populations of interior species that require core habitat conditions. Narrow corridors may serve primarily as movement pathways, allowing animals to travel between habitat patches, but providing little breeding or foraging habitat. The minimum width needed for corridor function varies enormously among species, from a few meters for some small mammals to several kilometers for large carnivores. Different species perceive landscape connectivity in dramatically different ways. A bird that readily flies across open areas may see a landscape as highly connected even when terrestrial animals find it completely fragmented. Conversely, a forest-dwelling salamander may be unable to cross even narrow gaps in tree cover that seem trivial to larger, more mobile animals. Effective corridor design must consider the movement capabilities and habitat requirements of the specific species being targeted. The Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative exemplifies landscape-scale corridor conservation. This ambitious project seeks to maintain connectivity across 2,000 miles of mountain landscape from Yellowstone National Park to Canada's Yukon Territory. The corridor encompasses multiple habitat types and serves numerous species, from grizzly bears that need vast territories to migratory birds that follow mountain valleys during seasonal movements. Wildlife overpasses and underpasses represent engineered solutions to habitat fragmentation caused by roads and highways. These structures allow animals to cross transportation corridors safely while maintaining vehicle traffic flow. The success of these crossings varies by design and location, but some have achieved remarkable results. Banff National Park's wildlife overpasses have reduced wildlife vehicle collisions by over 80% while allowing safe passage for species ranging from elk to wolverines. Urban corridors face unique challenges and opportunities in connecting habitats within developed landscapes. Greenways along streams, abandoned railway corridors, and linear parks can provide connectivity for urban adapted species while offering recreational opportunities for people. However, urban corridors often contain novel environments that differ significantly from natural habitats, supporting different species assemblages than would be found in rural corridors. The matrix habitat surrounding corridors influences their effectiveness as much as the corridors themselves. A corridor of native vegetation surrounded by intensive agriculture may function very differently from the same corridor in a landscape of low-intensity grazing or suburban development. Species differ in their willingness to venture into matrix habitats, affecting both their use of corridors and their ability to move between habitat patches. Stepped corridors or chains of habitat patches can provide connectivity even when continuous corridors are impossible to establish. These stepping stone networks work particularly well for highly mobile species that can make relatively long movements between habitat patches. Migratory birds may use wetlands spaced many miles apart as long as the distances between them fall within their flight capabilities. The temporal aspect of corridor function often receives less attention than spatial design, but timing can be crucial for corridor effectiveness. Some species use corridors only during specific seasons or life stages. Amphibians may move along corridors primarily during breeding migrations, while birds may use them mainly during dispersal of young animals. Understanding these temporal patterns helps optimize corridor management and protection. Agricultural landscapes offer opportunities for creating corridors through working lands that continue to provide economic benefits while supporting wildlife movement. Hedgerows, riparian buffers, and conservation strips can create networks of semi natural habitat within farmland. While these features may not support the full complement of native species found in natural habitats, they can facilitate movement for many species while providing ecosystem services like erosion control and pollinator habitat. The restoration of degraded corridors presents both challenges and opportunities for landscape connectivity. Abandoned transportation corridors, degraded riparian areas, and former agricultural lands can often be restored to provide habitat connectivity. However, restoration success varies widely depending on site conditions, restoration techniques, and the landscape context surrounding restoration sites. Climate change adds new urgency to corridor conservation by creating pressure for species to shift their ranges in response to changing environmental conditions. Traditional corridors that connect similar habitats may become less useful if climate change makes those habitats unsuitable throughout their current range. Climate adapted corridors must facilitate movement across environmental gradients, allowing species to track suitable conditions as they shift across landscapes. Elevational corridors in mountainous regions may become particularly important under climate change scenarios. As temperature zones shift upslope, species will need pathways that allow movement to higher elevations. Corridors that connect lowland and montane habitats can provide escape routes for species fleeing warming temperatures, though ultimately these corridors lead to finite mountain peaks where further upslope movement becomes impossible. The social and political aspects of corridor conservation often determine success or failure more than biological considerations. Corridors typically cross multiple ownerships and jurisdictions, requiring coordination among diverse stakeholders with different interests and priorities. Private landowners control much of the land needed for effective corridors, making voluntary conservation programs and incentive systems crucial for corridor success. Land trusts and conservation easements provide tools for protecting corridor lands while allowing continued private ownership. These mechanisms can protect critical connectivity while compensating landowners for development rights or management restrictions. Conservation easements offer permanent protection but require significant financial resources and willing landowners. Corridor conservation faces the challenge of protecting linear features that may be more vulnerable to disturbance than compact habitat patches. Corridors present large amounts of edge habitat relative to their area, making them susceptible to invasion by exotic species and disturbance from adjacent land uses. They may also be more vulnerable to catastrophic disturbances like fires or storms that could eliminate connectivity across their entire length. The effectiveness of corridors cannot be assumed but must be demonstrated through monitoring and research. Simply creating what appears to be suitable corridor habitat does not guarantee that target species will actually use it for movement between habitat patches. Effective corridor conservation requires adaptive management based on monitoring of animal movements, population dynamics, and habitat conditions. Genetic monitoring provides powerful tools for assessing corridor function by measuring gene flow between populations connected by corridors. When corridors successfully facilitate movement, genetic analysis should show evidence of breeding between individuals from different habitat patches. Conversely, genetic isolation between patches suggests that corridors are not providing effective connectivity. The scale of corridor planning must match the scale of species movements and landscape processes. Local corridors may suffice for small sedentary species, while wide-ranging species require connectivity at regional or continental scales. Large carnivores like wolves and mountain lions may need corridors spanning multiple states or provinces, requiring coordination among numerous jurisdictions and stakeholders. Corridor design for multiple species presents complex trade-offs because different species have very different connectivity needs. What works for forest birds may be unsuitable for grassland mammals. Wide corridors that accommodate large mammals may alter microclimatic conditions in ways that make them unsuitable for small forest interior species. Successful multi-species corridors often incorporate diverse habitat types and structural features. Technological advances are improving corridor planning through sophisticated modeling and mapping tools. Geographic information systems allow planners to analyze landscape patterns and identify optimal corridor routes based on habitat quality, human development patterns, and movement costs for different species. Remote sensing provides detailed information about vegetation cover and landscape changes over time. Conservation organizations are increasingly thinking beyond individual corridors to design comprehensive connectivity networks that link protected areas across entire regions. These networks recognize that single corridors may not be sufficient to maintain viable populations and ecosystem processes. Instead, they seek to create redundant pathways that provide multiple options for species movement and maintain connectivity even if some corridors are lost. The success of corridor conservation ultimately depends on viewing landscapes as integrated systems rather than collections of isolated habitat patches. This perspective recognizes that connectivity is not just about moving animals between patches, but about maintaining the ecological processes that sustain entire landscapes. Effective corridor conservation creates networks that support not only individual species movement, but the flow of energy, nutrients, and genetic material that keeps ecosystems functioning. The dream of ecological restoration is compelling in its simplicity. If human activities have destroyed natural habitats, perhaps human ingenuity can bring them back. Across the globe, degraded prairies are being replanted with native grasses, former strip mines are being reforested, and drained wetlands are being reflooded in ambitious attempts to recreate what was lost. These restoration efforts have achieved remarkable successes, but they have also revealed the sobering limits of our ability to truly recreate the complex systems that evolution built over millions of years. Restoration ecology emerged as a scientific discipline from the recognition that protecting existing habitats, while crucial, would not be sufficient to maintain biodiversity in landscapes where the majority of natural habitat had already been destroyed. If ecosystems could be restored on degraded lands, it might be possible to expand habitat availability while reducing pressure on remaining natural areas. This optimistic vision has driven enormous investments in restoration projects worldwide. The theoretical foundation of restoration rests on the concept of ecological succession, the predictable sequence of community changes that occur as ecosystems develop over time. By understanding successional processes, restoration practitioners believed they could accelerate natural recovery by providing appropriate starting conditions and removing barriers to succession. Early restoration efforts focused on establishing plant communities, assuming that animal communities would naturally follow once suitable habitat was created. Prairie restoration has become one of the most extensively studied forms of ecological restoration, partly because grassland ecosystems were among the most completely destroyed habitat types. The apparent simplicity of grasslands communities dominated by grasses and forbs, rather than complex forest structure, made them seem like promising candidates for restoration. Early prairie restoration efforts in the Midwest achieved remarkable success in reestablishing diverse plant communities on former agricultural land. However, decades of research have revealed that even successful prairie restorations rarely recreate the full complexity of original grassland ecosystems. Restored prairies typically support fewer plant species than remnant prairies, often lacking many of the rare and specialized species that characterized pre settlement grasslands. The soil communities of restored prairies differ substantially from those of remnants, missing many of the mycorrhizal fungi and invertebrate species that form the unseen foundation of grassland ecosystems. The temporal dimension of restoration presents fundamental challenges that become more apparent with time. Original prairie ecosystems developed over thousands of years, with soil organic matter accumulating through countless cycles of plant growth and decomposition. The deep, carbon rich soils that supported diverse prairie plant communities cannot be recreated in decades. Restored prairies may look remarkably similar to original grasslands above ground, while lacking the underground complexity that sustains them. Wetland restoration has achieved notable successes in recreating some ecosystem functions, particularly those related to hydrology and water quality improvement. Constructed wetlands can effectively remove pollutants from agricultural runoff and urban stormwater while providing habitat for waterfowl and other wetland dependent species. The relatively rapid colonization of restored wetlands by mobile species like birds creates visible signs of restoration success that have helped build political and financial support for wetland restoration programs. Yet restored wetlands often function differently from natural wetlands in subtle but important ways. The plant communities of restored wetlands are frequently dominated by a few aggressive species rather than the diverse assemblages found in natural systems. The invertebrate communities that form the base of wetland food webs may take years or decades to develop complexity approaching that of natural wetlands. Many specialized wetland species appear unable to colonize restored sites, particularly if source populations are not available in the surrounding landscape. Forest restoration faces the longest timescales and perhaps the greatest challenges of any restoration type. While tree seedlings can be planted relatively easily, creating the structural complexity of mature forests requires decades to centuries. The specialized species associated with old-growth forests may never colonize restored sites within human timescales. Even when restoration efforts successfully establish tree cover, the resulting forests often lack the dead wood, canopy gaps, and understory diversity that characterize natural forest ecosystems. The selection of restoration targets presents difficult choices about what to restore and when. Should restoration efforts attempt to recreate historical conditions, or should they focus on creating ecosystems adapted to current and future environmental conditions? Climate change complicates these decisions by making historical conditions potentially unsuitable for current restoration sites. Some restoration projects now focus on creating novel ecosystems that provide ecosystem functions and support native species while acknowledging that exact historical recreation may be impossible Restoration in urban and suburban environments faces unique challenges and opportunities. Urban restoration sites often have severely degraded soils, altered hydrology, and high levels of disturbance that make establishing native plant communities difficult. Yet urban restoration can provide valuable habitat for wildlife while offering educational and recreational opportunities for people. Urban restoration projects must balance ecological goals with social needs and practical constraints like maintenance requirements and public safety concerns. The science of restoration ecology has revealed the importance of considering ecosystem processes rather than just species composition. Successful restoration requires reestablishing not only the plants and animals that lived in an ecosystem, but also the ecological processes like nutrient cycling, disturbance regimes, and species interactions that maintained ecosystem function. This process focused approach has led to innovations like prescribed burning in grassland restoration and the reintroduction of large herbivores to maintain grazing patterns. Restoration genetics addresses the challenges of selecting appropriate plant and animal material for restoration projects. Plants grown from local seed sources are typically better adapted to local conditions than those from distant sources, but local populations may have been eliminated or genetically depleted by habitat destruction. Restoration practitioners must balance the benefits of local adaptation against the risks of using genetically impoverished source material. Reference ecosystems provide templates for restoration goals, but finding appropriate reference sites becomes increasingly difficult as natural habitats disappear. Restoration practitioners often must piece together information from multiple degraded sites, historical records, and scientific literature to understand what original ecosystems might have looked like. The lack of intact reference ecosystems means that restoration goals are often based on incomplete or idealized visions of historical conditions. The invasion of exotic species poses ongoing challenges for restoration projects. Restored habitats are often particularly vulnerable to invasion because they lack the established plant communities and soil conditions that might resist exotic species establishment. Invasive species management can become a major ongoing cost for restoration projects, sometimes requiring more resources than initial establishment. Climate change may favor exotic species over natives in many restoration sites, making long-term success increasingly difficult. Restoration monitoring reveals both the successes and limitations of restoration efforts. Short-term monitoring often shows encouraging results as planted species establish and mobile animals colonize restored sites. Long-term monitoring frequently reveals more sobering patterns, with restored ecosystems diverging from natural systems over time rather than converging toward them. Many restoration projects lack funding for long-term monitoring, making it difficult to assess their ultimate success or failure. The scaling up of restoration efforts from individual projects to landscape-level initiatives presents logistical and financial challenges. While small restoration projects can demonstrate proof of concept, achieving significant conservation benefits requires restoration at scales that match the magnitude of habitat loss. Landscape scale restoration requires coordination among multiple landowners and jurisdictions while addressing complex interactions between restored and remaining natural habitats. Passive restoration, simply removing disturbances and allowing natural succession to proceed, sometimes achieves better results than active restoration involving planting and intensive management. Natural succession can reestablish native species from seed banks and nearby source populations while avoiding the disruption associated with active management. However, passive restoration requires that degradation has not proceeded too far and that sources of native species remain available in the landscape. The economic costs of restoration vary enormously depending on site conditions, restoration goals, and maintenance requirements. While some restoration projects can be accomplished relatively inexpensively, others require ongoing inputs that make them prohibitively expensive for large-scale implementation. Cost-benefit analyses suggest that preventing habitat destruction is almost always more cost-effective than attempting restoration after degradation has occurred. Restoration success stories provide hope for the possibility of recovering degraded ecosystems while revealing the conditions necessary for success. The restoration of the Kissimmee River in Florida reversed decades of channelization, returning natural flow patterns and reestablishing wetland habitats. The Chicago Wilderness Project has restored thousands of acres of prairie and forest in the metropolitan area. These successes required sustained commitments of resources and political support over decades. The limits of restoration become apparent when projects attempt to restore ecosystems that have been severely degraded or where critical components have been permanently lost. Species that have gone extinct cannot be restored. Soils that have been stripped away cannot be quickly replaced. Climate conditions that supported historical ecosystems may no longer exist. Understanding these limits helps focus restoration efforts on sites and goals where success is most likely. Assisted migration and novel ecosystem management represent emerging approaches that acknowledge the limitations of traditional restoration while seeking to maintain ecosystem functions under changing conditions. These approaches may involve establishing species outside their historical ranges or creating new combinations of species that can provide ecosystem services under current conditions. While controversial, these approaches may become necessary as climate change makes historical restoration targets increasingly unrealistic. Restoration offers genuine hope for expanding habitat availability and recovering ecosystem functions in degraded landscapes. However, the promise of restoration should not be used to justify continued habitat destruction based on the assumption that damaged ecosystems can be easily repaired. The most successful restoration projects demonstrate both the potential for ecosystem recovery and the irreplaceable value of protecting natural habitats before they are lost. In the end, we must confront a fundamental truth. We live on a planet where natural habitats will continue to be rare and precious, surrounded by landscapes shaped primarily by human needs and activities. The age of vast, unbroken wilderness has passed for most of the world, replaced by a mosaic of cities, farms, roads, and scattered fragments of what once was. This reality need not be cause for despair, but it does require us to reimagine our relationship with the natural world and to discover how both humans and wildlife can thrive in the landscapes we have created. Urban ecology has emerged as one of the most surprising and hopeful fields in conservation biology. Cities, once viewed as biological deserts, are revealing themselves to be more complex and dynamic than anyone imagined. Urban environments create novel habitat types that support unexpected combinations of native and non-native species. Green roofs provide nesting sites for birds. Abandoned lots become meadows. Stormwater retention ponds serve as urban wetlands. These habitats may not resemble pre-settlement ecosystems, but they demonstrate life's remarkable ability to adapt to new conditions. Some species have not just survived in urban environments, but thrived in ways that challenge our assumptions about habitat requirements. Peregrine falcons, once nearly extinct due to pesticide poisoning, have found urban skyscrapers to be excellent substitutes for their traditional cliff nesting sites. The abundance of pigeons provides a reliable food source, while the vertical structure of cities mimics the canyon environments where these birds evolved. Urban peregrine populations now exceed pre-pesticide levels in many cities. Coyotes exemplify the behavioral flexibility that allows some species to colonize urban environments successfully. Originally prairie and desert animals, coyotes have expanded their range to include virtually every major North American city. They have learned to navigate traffic, exploit new food sources ranging from pet food to fallen fruit, and modify their behavior to avoid human contact during daylight hours. Their success reveals how generalist species with flexible behaviors can find opportunities in human modified landscapes. However, urban adaptation often comes with hidden costs that become apparent only through careful study. Urban birds face increased stress from noise pollution, which can interfere with communication and territory establishment. Light pollution disrupts natural circadian rhythms and navigation systems. Air pollution affects respiratory health. Urban environments may appear to support healthy wildlife populations while actually functioning as population sinks that require constant immigration from surrounding areas to maintain stable numbers. The concept of novel ecosystems acknowledges that many human modified environments will never return to their pre disturbance state, but may still provide valuable ecological functions. Abandoned industrial sites often develop unique plant communities that include both native and non native species in combinations that never existed historically. While these novel ecosystems may not support the same species as original habitats, they can provide stepping stones for wildlife movement and serve important ecological functions like carbon storage and stormwater management. Working landscapes, areas managed for human purposes but also supporting wildlife, represent perhaps the greatest opportunity for expanding habitat availability in human-dominated regions. Agricultural lands managed with wildlife-friendly practices can support significant biodiversity while continuing to produce food. Shade-grown coffee plantations in Central America provide habitat for dozens of migratory bird species. Rangelands grazed at appropriate intensities can support grassland bird communities. The key lies in finding management practices that balance human needs with habitat provision. The integration of wildlife considerations into agricultural planning has led to innovations that benefit both farmers and wildlife. Hedgerows provide habitat for beneficial insects that control crop pests while offering nesting sites for birds. Cover crops planted between growing seasons prevent soil erosion while providing food for wildlife. Constructed wetlands treat agricultural runoff while creating habitat for waterfowl and amphibians. These practices demonstrate that conservation and production need not be mutually exclusive. Green infrastructure in urban areas serves multiple functions while providing habitat opportunities. Bioswales that manage stormwater runoff can support native plant communities and provide food for pollinators. Urban forests reduce air pollution and moderate temperatures while providing habitat for birds and small mammals. Green corridors along abandoned railways or utility rights of way can connect habitat fragments across metropolitan areas. The role of private landowners in habitat conservation has become increasingly important as public protected areas prove insufficient to maintain biodiversity. In many regions, private lands contain more habitat than public protected areas and support larger wildlife populations. Voluntary conservation programs that provide technical assistance and financial incentives to private landowners have achieved remarkable success in maintaining and restoring habitat on working lands. Conservation easements allow private landowners to maintain ownership and continue compatible land uses while permanently protecting habitat values. These agreements can be tailored to specific properties and species needs, allowing grazing or forestry activities that maintain habitat while preventing subdivision or development. The flexibility of conservation easements has made them attractive to landowners who want to protect their land's conservation values while maintaining economic productivity. Citizen science initiatives engage urban and suburban residents in monitoring and conservation activities that contribute to habitat management. Backyard bird counts provide valuable data on urban bird populations. Community gardens create habitat while providing food and educational opportunities. Invasive species removal projects improve habitat quality while educating participants about ecosystem management. These programs build conservation awareness while accomplishing meaningful habitat improvements. The design of human settlements can significantly influence their compatibility with wildlife. Traditional suburban development patterns that emphasize large lawns and non-native landscaping provide little habitat value while creating barriers to wildlife movement. Alternative development approaches that incorporate native vegetation, reduce impervious surfaces, and maintain natural features can support much higher levels of biodiversity while still meeting human housing needs. Wildlife corridors in developed landscapes often follow human infrastructure like streams, utility easements, and transportation corridors. While these linear features may create barriers for some species, they can also provide movement pathways when appropriately managed. Riparian zones, protected from development, can serve as green corridors that connect habitat fragments across urban and suburban areas. The tolerance of both humans and wildlife for coexistence varies greatly among species and situations. Some wildlife species readily adapt to human presence and may even benefit from human activities. Others require significant buffer zones and minimal disturbance to maintain viable populations. Understanding these tolerance levels helps guide land use planning that maximizes opportunities for coexistence while respecting the needs of sensitive species. Human attitudes toward wildlife strongly influence coexistence outcomes. Communities that value wildlife presence and understand basic ecology are more likely to implement management practices that support wildlife. Education programs that help people understand wildlife behavior and ecological needs can reduce conflicts while building support for habitat conservation. When people understand why bats are beneficial or how native plants support pollinators, they become more willing to modify their practices to support wildlife. The management of human-wildlife conflicts requires balancing legitimate human concerns with wildlife conservation needs. Property damage, agricultural losses, and safety concerns are real issues that must be addressed for coexistence to be sustainable. Effective conflict management often involves multiple strategies, including habitat modification, exclusion techniques, population management, and compensation programs for economic losses. Climate change adds new dimensions to coexistence as species ranges shift and environmental conditions change. Urban areas may become climate refugia For some species, as heat islands, moderate cold temperatures. Conversely, urban heat effects may make cities unsuitable for species adapted to cooler conditions. Managing for climate adaptation requires flexibility in conservation approaches and willingness to accept novel species assemblages. The concept of reconciliation ecology suggests that rather than focusing solely on preserving pristine habitats, conservation should also emphasize modifying human dominated landscapes to support native species. This approach recognizes that most of the world's surface will remain under human management and seeks to make these areas as hospitable to wildlife as possible. Reconciliation ecology does not replace the need for protected areas, but complements them by expanding habitat availability across broader landscapes. Technology is creating new opportunities for monitoring and managing wildlife in human dominated landscapes. Remote sensing allows tracking of habitat changes across large areas. GPS collars reveal how animals move through developed landscapes. Acoustic monitoring detects the presence of species that are difficult to observe directly. These tools provide information that can guide management decisions and measure conservation success. The economics of coexistence often favor wildlife friendly practices when ecosystem services and other benefits are properly valued. Urban trees provide cooling and air purification services worth thousands of dollars per tree. Wetlands in developed areas prevent flooding damage while treating stormwater. Pollinator habitat supports agricultural production. When these benefits are quantified and included in planning decisions, wildlife conservation often becomes economically attractive. International migration and global connectivity mean that local habitat management decisions can have far reaching consequences. Urban parks in Texas may provide critical stopover habitat for birds wintering in Central America. Suburban gardens in temperate regions may support pollinators that also visit agricultural crops. Understanding these connections helps justify local conservation investments by demonstrating their broader benefits. The future of conservation increasingly lies not in pristine wilderness areas, but in the ordinary landscapes where most people live and work. These landscapes may never support the full complement of species that existed before human settlement, but they can support surprising levels of biodiversity when managed with wildlife considerations in mind. The challenge lies in developing planning and management approaches that seamlessly integrate human needs with habitat provision. Living with what remains requires accepting that perfect restoration of pre-human conditions is impossible while refusing to accept that current degraded conditions are permanent. It means finding hope in the adaptability of both humans and wildlife while working to create landscapes that serve the needs of both. In these human dominated landscapes, every garden that includes native plants, every field margin left unmowed, and every green roof installed represents a small victory for coexistence. The story of habitat loss is ultimately a story about relationships between humans and nature, between different species, and between local actions and global consequences. As we reshape these relationships for an uncertain future, we carry with us both the sobering lessons of what we have lost and the inspiring examples of what remains possible when we choose to share our landscapes with the remarkable diversity of life that calls this planet home.